Today is all about what we do with that data. So we've now collected all this data. We know the condition that our city or village is in. The question now is, how do we turn that into a plan, which ultimately turns into action? So that's really our goal today. Quick introductions. My name's Travis Helmkamp. I'm a project manager at Oates. We are assisting CMAP with these presentations. Sort of my history is I've spent the last 12 years as a consultant doing these plans for cities, from 5,000 to 300,000 people. We've gone through the process. We've worked with the city. So if you have any questions between myself and next I'll introduce Robin Jones. She's the director of the Great Lakes ADA Center. If you guys don't know the Great Lakes ADA Center, I strongly encourage you to get to know the Great Lakes ADA Center. So they are located here in Chicago. They're headquartered out of UIC, and they are your technical resource for ADA questions. They have a technical assistance line. They offer webinar series. They offer basically anything that you want to know about the world of ADA. If you give the Great Lakes ADA Center a call, they can probably answer your question. And if they can't, they can certainly point you in the right direction. And really our goal today is to help you guys. You know, these are going to be your guys' plans that you're going to be producing. So please come with questions. Definitely don't have to wait till the end to ask them. If you have a question, just raise your hand and we will run a microphone around to you. Am I not on?
No, you're good.
Okay. So really our goals today are, we're going to start off with the value of community engagement. We talked a little bit about it yesterday. Today is going to be much more in-depth and much more what that engagement, an example engagement strategy that we think works really well. Next, we're going to go into the value of prioritization, sort of what prioritizing can it let you do and sort of how it can help make your ADA plan hopefully a little bit more manageable. The steps of a plan, the federal government does lay out very nice steps as to what's included in an ADA transition plan. Handling grievances. Spend a little bit of time on sort of what is a grievance, what isn't a grievance, and sort of what that grievance procedure process looks like. The value of a schedule and budget, and lastly, how do you turn this plan into action? And with that, to start community engagement, I'll hand it off to Robin.
Thank you. Get mic'd up here for a second. Good morning, everybody. So as we talked, how many of you were here yesterday? So good number. Okay, great. Some of you who were not, hopefully, well, it'll make sense as we talk through this. And so as introduced, I am Robin Jones, and I'm with the Great Lakes ADA Center. I am going to talk about, as introduced, community engagement. So when you talk about community engagement, it's so many different things. And I know you already engage with the public on a regular basis already. This is a little bit different in regards to the fact that this is something that is really critically important because you're dealing with issues and such that are very specific and very personal to people with disabilities, and often issues that are not as well known by you or understood by you. There's something that you know what a barrier is, you know whatever, but you don't necessarily know how that barrier impacts somebody. If you haven't used a wheelchair, if you are not somebody who's blind, if you're not somebody who's deaf or whatever, yes, you can have empathy, etc., but you're never really going to know what that person experiences or how that impacts them until you get that feedback directly from that person. In fact, sometimes people talk about doing simulations, to try to get a feel and put themselves in a wheelchair and see how it works. That, might give you an idea, but that's not how everybody functions every day, and everybody has different strengths, and you're getting into a wheelchair with good upper stomach strength, good, perfect trunk control and things of that nature, and somebody who has got a paralysis or something, they don't have that, so even your experience will not be exactly the same. So it's just something that, really in community engagement helps to educate you, and also keeps the community involved and understood, feeling that they're understood or that they're valued as part of this process. We have here in the first bullet that it's required by the Americans with Disabilities Act, but I want to clarify that particular issue because right now there's nothing that's required by the Americans with Disabilities Act. This was something that was required under the ADA when it was first passed in 1990 with the requirement for a transition plan and a self-evaluation to be completed by July of 1995. And part of that process was a requirement to have community engagement in that process. But as we talked about yesterday, those are no longer legal requirements. Those dates are gone. There's nothing the Department of Justice can come and haunt you and tell you that, you didn't do it, you're going to get, fined, you're going to get whatever. We talked about these fact that these things are tools to help you with your compliance under the Americans with Disabilities Act. But what was critical and important in that requirement from 1991 to 1995 was community engagement. And that was very much a part of the Department of Justice's obligation and responsibilities, that you had to demonstrate and document community engagement. We still feel that's critically important in this process if you really are going to truly do it right and don't want to be challenged by the community for what you have decided to do or not do. And of course, the goal is obviously collaboration with the community. And really key, if you don't already have, it's about building and fostering relationships and building bridges with that community. Because oftentimes there might, and at this time, be some tension or some animosity. I just got a TA forwarded to me from my office from last night or yesterday that I was looking at this morning. And it's somebody that is a citizen who uses a wheelchair. And currently, right now, there are curb cuts on both sides of a street, which is fine, continuous path of travel. And somewhere along the line, somewhere at an intersection, a municipality in the middle of the intersection put a curb cut on the other side. Now, there's not any direct path to going there or anything. They just put in a curb cut over there. And it's not a crosswalk, it's not a marked crosswalk or anything of that nature. And so the municipality has decided, for whatever reason, to remove that curb cut. And now this is a citizen who's extremely upset about the removal of that curb cut because he uses it to kind of cross the street and go to the other side, even though it's not a marked crossing, it's not a legitimate, crossing, whatever. But he's used to using it. It's been there. He's been using it, et cetera. Even though it's in the middle, it's not. Somebody who's blind would never find it because there's no, rhyme or reason to why it's there. And so now he is very upset with the community, and he's arguing. He wants to sue the community for removing an accessible feature. Okay, well, that crosswalk's not really a legitimate, that curb cut's not really a legitimate curb cut anyway. And one of the reasons they want to remove it is because it's not. But now you've got a citizen issue here, okay? Because the citizen's been using it and he's used to using it, and now he's upset because he'll have to go farther because he's going to have to go down to the next corner to go across, instead of where he was going across there because they had this kind of curb cut in the middle that really didn't, why it ever got put in, who knows? It probably got put in before the other ones did, and there was not a direct path. I have no idea. He sent me a diagram and it made no sense. I to this day would not. But that's the kind of thing that, causes problems, when you do that, you engage with the community of why you did that, why you didn't do that, and those kinds of things. So that's just an example. It just happened to me last night with a TA. You want to make sure that you engage the entirety of your community, not just a certain check, not just those that are the loudest, or let's say that, how many of you in your communities have some kind of a commission or committee or anything like a mayor's committee or anything like that for people with disabilities? Any of you in a few of your communities do? Which communities are you? Hoffman Estates. Yep, I knew Hoffman Estates did, yep. Oak Park, yep, I knew Oak Park did too. I was on it at one time, way back when I lived there. I know Arlington Heights says, I know there's a couple communities that do this. I would assume if I was to say, I make an assumption that you find that valuable, that they give input, but also they can probably be kind of, a thorn in your side sometimes too, because they will often, be the voice that people will go to, et cetera. But that shouldn't be your only place to go to, because that's just representative of a certain group of people that, got identified who were, maybe politically connected, maybe just, vocal or whatever, they got appointed to those things. That still is that vast, bigger community out there that you want to make sure that you're engaging with. So you want to engage in the entirety of the community. And when I talk about disability, I'm talking about family members of people with who have disabilities, as well as the people who have disabilities. Because when you think about it, most people, there's 20.5 million families in this country that have at least one person with a disability. And that could be a child, or it could be a grandparent, or whatever. And when I'm going out in the community and I'm doing things, I'm doing it with my family. So if there's a barrier to people with disabilities, it's impacting that whole family. It's not just impacting that one person. So families are often a voice. So be sure you're looking at that entirety. Also make sure that your engagement is purposeful. don't make it tokenism. Make sure it's not tokenism. That is too often, and the disability community is extremely frustrated by that. That, oh yeah, did we put that one person with a disability on the committee, or or whatever kind of a thing. You really be careful about tokenism. Make sure that your engagement with them is very purposeful. Again, also make sure that you engage prior to forming your opinions. Don't come in with, this is what we're going to do, and here. We've already decided, we've already made our, decisions and opinions, et cetera. Make sure that you're engaging them prior to that so that you have their perspective and things of that nature, because otherwise you're going to alienate them if they think that all you're asking for is a rubber stamp. You've already made the decisions, whatever we say is not going to, make a difference, whatever, because again, your interaction with that community could change your opinions and probably will change your opinions. Again, use the community feedback to guide prioritization, not to confirm your own assumptions. They should really be helping you drive that, what your prioritization process is, because it is the disability community that uses these features. Right? You might have that, a perfect idea, this is going to be the perfect whatever, and the disability community is going to say, no, that's not going to work for us. That's not how we use it. That's not how we engage with this particular element, in the community. Some different groups, when you think about what we often get the question, we get a lot of calls in our office about who and how do we connect with the disability community? Who are they? What are they, et cetera? So one of the things you have to look at is, your whole engagement is very broad. The disability community is broad by itself, okay? So again, when you think about the disability community, and we'll talk a little bit more about who that is in a minute, you want to be engaging with the entire disability community. But also at the same time, you've got these other groups that you need to also be interfacing with that are impacted by what you do and have a role in some of the things that you do. So transit. So if you've got bus stops, as an example, as part of you, and that's separate. Your transit agency is separate from your municipality or whatever, or has different authorities and things of that nature. You need to be sure that you're communicating with them, because if they're identifying transit stops and those transit stops connect to your public rights of way, it is your responsibility and your obligations. It's a shared obligation in regards to that. So you need to be conversing with them and talking to them and having them be a part of that process, so you make sure that we don't have a bus pad placed someplace that has no connection to any meaningful path of travel. And it's not appropriate to just drop somebody off in the street, and have them find their way to the sidewalk. Residents in general, overall, your residents, your community, again, outreaching, because the disability community, believe it or not everybody identifies as a person with a disability. Okay, not everybody who's blind, not everybody who's deaf, hard of hearing, not everybody who might have heart disease, or somebody, everybody who has arthritis or whatever will necessarily say, I have a disability. I'm a member of the disability community. Okay, but they're impacted. They have limitations. They have trouble walking. They have trouble seeing, trouble hearing, etc. They benefit from the accessibility features. So make sure that you're broad in that you look at your whole overall resident community, not just those that identify or self-identify as having a disability. Especially when you think about your older community, be sure that you're connecting with your aging community. Be sure that you're also connecting with your community of groups that are potential shared users, like bikers and things of that nature, with some of your shared paths and stuff of that nature. Huge impact. Your mothers who are also using strollers, and stuff. I mean, this is, part of these people who are, accessibility features are not reserved only for people with disabilities, right? A curb cut's not only for somebody with a disability. Oh, you're a disability, you can use the curb cut. You don't, you have to use the curb. That's not how it goes. Everybody uses these things. They're impacted by broken concrete as much as somebody with a disability is impacted by broken concrete, by uneven surfaces and things of that nature. So again, be inclusive. Service providers who work with people with disabilities, this is one of your best ways to reach out to the disability community. You have a vast array of service providers in your community that probably serve some cross disability, but some very specific to certain types of disabilities. So you're going to have those that serve the aging community. You're going to have those that probably serve specifically individuals with intellectual disabilities, probably specifically those that serve people with developmental disabilities, cerebral palsy, Down syndrome, etc. cetera. And then you're going to have those that probably work with people who are deaf or hard of hearing, or people who are blind or low vision, mental health, et cetera. So those service providers are going to be a great way for you to reach the disability community itself. They should be on your mailing list. You should be part of asking them to disseminate to their clients this information so that they can get that information. That's how you get it out. It's kind of like spidering, out, how we used to use telephones, like the telephone tree, kind of thing. That's kind of the same method. Get it out to the service providers. They'll get it out to their clients, et cetera. Business owners, they have a stake in this also. Business owners, are interested in, what happens in their community, what happens from access, because it affects their customers with disabilities. So if there's something happening on Main Street with sidewalks and things of that nature being broken up, or curb cuts being problematic, whatever, in front of a store, or on-street parking issues, et cetera, that's going to impact the business owners in regard to those customers, because a lot of customers with disabilities will frequent stores that are easier to get into, that have access features, et cetera, associated either in or around them to be able to get there. School districts, of course, because kids with disabilities, families, and such of that nature, and because, again, school districts often control their buses, control their bus stops for schools. It's not just public transit, it's also where the school buses are coming and going and dropping off and picking up kids and things of that nature as well. How are kids in the flow of things to and from school? And then community groups in general, your civic groups and things of that nature, where often people with disabilities might be also engaged or may have a vested interest in what you're doing and want to become engaged. So again, do definitely make sure that you do dedicated outreach to undersourced, especially your BIPOC and low-income communities. These are groups that are often not involved, not left out. They're not used to being asked. They're not traditionally involved and engaged, et cetera. They sometimes are not part of some of our more organized groups and things of that nature. So make sure that you're also reaching out to these groups. Some of them, they will all need a very unique approach. One of the ways that we, in our office, because this is something that we are challenged with in making sure people understand their rights under the ADA, is we reach out to religious communities. We reach out to a lot of groups that specifically, immigrant groups that specifically serve those populations and help those populations and things of that nature. So really make sure that you're kind of thinking broadly and making sure that you're being inclusive of all people, not just using your traditional context and things of that nature to ensure that you reach these communities. And remember that with some of these folks, there's a lot of distrust and apathy. Nobody listens to us. Nobody asks our word. You might have language issues. You might have that English is not their first language. And so you have to make sure that you're putting information out that is going to be, in languages that they can understand, and that you have that option for them to provide feedback in their language, in their native language, etc. Yes, it takes more work, but you really need to make sure that you're engaging and doing this. And again, acknowledge the fact that there is mistrust, so you need to get their trust, which one of the best ways to do that is engage and somebody from their community to help you with that messaging. We all know that that's best, that, people hear information from individuals in their own community better than they're going to hear somebody. So me as a white female going into a black community and trying to convince them that they should participate with me is not going to go over as well as if I recruit somebody from the black community who will understand these issues that I can educate if they're not already familiar with, and ask them and help them to help me engage the community around these issues. Or somebody who's Spanish speaking, or somebody who's, Arabic, if that's a large population in my community, or whatever else it might be, Asian or whatever. So you just need to know your communities, know your makeup, and make sure that you're reaching out to those folks in doing that in a manner that's going to be relative to them. Again, remember, as I've already alluded to, broad range of disabilities. Don't only, while we think often, the international symbol of disability is the wheelchair, that's not the only person with a disability. In fact, statistically, only 16% of the population of people with disabilities, of that, 60.1 million people with disabilities in the census, use any kind of mobility device. But it is the population that faces the greatest barriers when it comes to the physical environment. So yes, we definitely want to make sure that we're engaging with that community, but remember, you also are talking about disabilities, mental health, You're talking about blind, low vision. You're talking about deaf, hard of hearing. You're talking about individuals with cognitive disabilities, head injuries, et cetera. You're also talking about people who have health conditions like seizure disorders and heart disease and allergies, asthma, and all kinds. I mean, there's no end. Cancer, et cetera. All of those things are disabilities. All of those could present limitations that are impacted by the physical environment. Again, I already alluded to the fact that it also includes those that support family members, service providers, et cetera. And I already alluded to the fact that the aging community is a strong part of this. While we say in our slide that the aging community may not identify as disabled, there's a lot of people who don't identify as disabled who would meet the definition of disability under the ADA, not just the aging. Again, that person with heart disease, that person with diabetes, that person who has a seizure disorder, et cetera. They will not always necessarily identify as having a disability. We already know, I mean, all of us have had grandparents or have parents that, have probably got limitations just from the aging process, but you even bring up the idea of disability and, oh, no, that's not me, that's them, I had a father who had horrible hearing and, wore hearing aids and everything, et cetera, and he stopped going to the movies because my mom refused to go with him because he would constantly stop her and say, what did they say? What did they say? What did they say? And we introduced him to assistive listening systems, which are available in a movie theater, which would have helped him with his hearing aids and his amplification, refused to use them because they were for people who were deaf. And if he used it, they wouldn't have one available when they came to go to the movie. That was his mindset, because that was not him, that was them, even though he would have been able to benefit from it. So, and that's not unusual at all. And that's really important to keep in mind. Identify key contacts within the respective communities. As I said, go out to those communities and reach out to them, even cold calling, them. Or if you do have commissions and things of that nature, use your commissions to help you identify who the broader disability community is. Don't be afraid to put something in the paper asking for the disability community to respond to you. That you're looking for people, et cetera. People like to be asked, like to be sought out, et cetera, that. So, don't be afraid to do that kind of thing. Recognize that there are just as there are differences in disabilities, there's also differences in reading, comprehension, and cognitive levels among people with disabilities. And I will say that that's the same of people without disabilities. Somebody being illiterate is not a disability under the ADA unless it's due to the fact that I may have had a underlying condition that causes my illiteracy, like a learning disability or something. But there is a lot of low literacy in our society for socioeconomic and other reasons. So really be aware of the fact that make sure your information is simple, simple language, et cetera. Don't use a lot of acronyms. Don't use a lot of big terminologies and things of that nature. Write information simple and clear and direct. Bullet points are really effective for getting information across versus long paragraphs of explaining, what you do or what your goals and things are. So make sure you're cognitive of that when you are creating any materials and when you are reaching out to the community. Really important is considering challenges when you are scheduling any accommodations. Depending on where you are in the Chicagoland area, the ability to get sign language interpreters and real-time captioners, it will vary greatly. We have found since COVID, the ability to get an on-site, in-person sign language interpreter is become a huge challenge. There are, the sign language interpreters have found that doing remote and being at home and sitting on a camera and not having to travel an hour to go someplace for an hour gig or whatever is far more profitable than to do in-person sign language. And you don't have to travel, don't have the roads, especially, with all the construction and, other things going on and stuff of that nature. So it's really become much more difficult. There are also only a few sign language interpreter referral agencies in the Chicago area. There's a lot of sign language interpreters. Some work freelance. We really strongly recommend that you actually reach out into your own community to see, do we have any sign language interpreters that live in Oak Park or live in wherever who would be interested in being on our registry or on our directory that we could contact when we need? And what are your parameters? Do you need 2 weeks notice? Do you need a 7-day notice? What do you need? What are your rates? All of those kinds of things. There are probably people in your own community that have these skills and probably work as freelancers or whatever, and you don't know it, but they might be a way to start. But it's really be aware of the fact that this plays into anything that you do. Right now, I'm struggling right now. I have events that I'm scheduling a month out right now for sign language in order to get a sign language interpreter in person at an event. Okay, so you really need to know who your vendors are, what your relationships are, what they need, and how to do it. Same with real-time captioning. Okay, we have found it a little bit easier to find in-person real-time captioners than sign language interpreters, because real-time captioners are still out in the courts and things of that nature, because a lot of them are court reporters and stuff of that nature. They do both because they use the same technologies. And so they tend to be a little bit more available for in-person than a sign language interpreter. But both could be a challenge to you depending on where you are geographically. So understand these issues when you're scheduling. Don't think that you can schedule on a whim a meeting next Thursday. Put your announcement out that you're going to have a meeting or whatever it might be. And then you had a call for somebody who's deaf and hard of hearing that says they need sign language or need real-time captioning or both. And now you're scrambling to find that. Because you didn't think in advance about the need to that. So when I'm planning, make sure I can get the accommodations before I set my dates and my things or know that I might have to change my dates because it would not be appropriate to move forward with a meeting without full access. And so these are going to be challenges that you're going to need to think about and be aware of in going through that process. Be flexible. Engage people where they live. Go into the communities. Understand that people with disabilities have greater challenges with transportation than people without disabilities because of the fact that many, many people with disabilities can't drive or are dependent on family members to transport them, and or if they are users of things like paratransit services, it's extremely unreliable service. It also needs to be scheduled in advance, that can present challenges for people from a scheduling related issue. So go out, engage them where they live. This is where you're going to get that feedback when you're engaging with the community, finding out for them some of those things as what are the good places to meet in your community? What are the good places to, times, dates, of the week, times of the day, etc. Attend community events. That's a great way. If there are community events, and that be a way that you can have a table that you might solicit feedback, at a community event. Where, I know a park has all kinds of things at the park, and I know so does Hoffman Estates and others communities do. That's a great place to get feedback, when you're in this process at whatever different points during the process. Also, just a way to disseminate information about what you're doing. And don't be afraid to try something new, think outside the box. Try different ways to engage, and again, get that feedback from the community. And of course, as Travis put on the slide, everybody loves food. We know that food will get people to come to anything. If there's that promise of food, even cookies and whatever, there is that whatever that will do that. And I know budgets are often an issue in providing food, but it is an enticement. And the disability community, as many of them are living on fixed incomes and limited amount of money and things of that nature, coming to something where they might get, a little bit of food definitely is an incentive to participate or to be engaged. As you look at doing things differently or doing a variety of different things, understand the limitations of using certain different modes of communication based on the community and disability group that you are engaging with. So understand that not everybody who has a disability and families that have disabilities have internet access. Yes, we kind of take it for granted that more and more people have internet access in their home. But if you're thinking about somebody who's living on $650 a month, which is a Social Security income for somebody who is on SSI, then the $29 a month for Verizon or for whatever, for internet access may not be in their budget. to do those things. They might not live somewhere that they can get that or something of that nature. Yes, more and more people have mobile devices. There's a lot of programs that provide mobile devices to people with disabilities and people with low income. So they will have cellular data that can often access websites and things of that nature. But that's really critical that you make sure that whatever you're putting out there that is also mobile friendly, okay? So we're not just putting something out there that, doesn't look the same on a mobile device that it does on a website, if that's what your expectation is that somebody's going to engage in that way, especially filling out forms and things of that nature. Surveys are not, many of us have tried to do that. They can and cannot be very unfriendly on a mobile device, et cetera. So be aware of that in regards to the modes that you use to do those kinds of things for accessibility. Understand the limitations of accessibility and make sure that any surveys that you are doing, if you are doing online surveys and things of that nature, that they are accessible, but don't only do them online. Make sure that there's a paper copy also available so that you're collecting and have multiple ways that people can give and can complete that survey. Don't just do an online survey option. If you're doing social media posts, make sure your social media is accessible, please. I alluded to that yesterday. Many of us are using Facebook, we're using Twitter, we're using Instagram, whether you're using some of the other ones or not, that's great. But please, please, please make sure that your people in your communities that are doing this are making sure that it's accessible social media. There are tools, and we could do a whole session on and if your offices in your community need some information on that, please contact us. We do training on accessible technology all the time. But these are really, really critical issues. Make sure wherever you're hosting your meetings is accessible. I mean accessibility, I'm talking about big A, not little a. I'm talking about meaning accessible to public transportation if there's public transportation. I'm meaning accessible, physically, accessible. I'm saying environmentally accessible, good lighting, accessible bathrooms, all of the things that, you need. Make sure, parking, that there's good accessible parking available as well. So that somebody's, is driving, is going to be able to access that parking. Even if you're having a special meeting and you only have 2 accessible parking spaces out front, think about setting up temporary accessible parking spaces by taking 2 spaces and making them, temporarily accessible, because you're going to be attracting a larger number of people with disabilities for this specific event, and those 2 accessible parking spaces are not going to be adequate for the potentially 15 people that you get that have a hang tag. Okay, so think about those as well as issues that can just be temporary. You're not required to, I'm just saying to make it more of an accessible meeting for you, for people. Again, any documents that you distribute must be accessible. When we talk about accessible documents, we're talking about, too often we just do a PDF of something, right? We created it in Word, we convert it to PDF, and that's what we hand out, or that's what we post on our website, or that's what we send as an attachment to the email. If that PDF document is not accessible, you've just blown it, 100%. Because PDFs, if they're not structured accessible, if you have images on your page and they don't have tags on them to describe what's there, or you have a graph on your page or something of that nature, a person who's blind, a person who's low vision can't see that. A person who uses assistive technology like a screen reader to read what's on there, or uses text to speech, to interact with that, they're not going to be able to interact with your document. So you need to make sure that whoever's creating your documents is creating those documents as accessible documents for distribution purposes. Anything that you distribute, whether it be email, whether it be on a website, whether it be a flyer, or etc., and you're announcing that you're having a meeting or something, make sure you have language on that thing, on that announcement that says if you need accommodations for the event or for the materials, like if I need it in Braille, I'm not saying go out and make things in Braille proactively, but if somebody contacts you and says they're going to need that document that you're submitting out in Braille, you need to be able to produce that document in Braille, which means you need to know where are our Braille producers, what do they need, how much lead time do they need, etc., to do these kinds of things, so that you can take those requests and you can respond to those requests. Typically your ADA coordinator will help you with these particular things, but again, make sure that they're accessible. Even if you're doing things electronically, like by email and stuff, don't use stylized and fancy email, and embed images and stuff in your email either, because that's just as inaccessible as the document is unless you've made it accessible. And again, there's tools available within Word, within PowerPoint, within Excel, within all of these things to make them accessible. You just need to know how to use them to make them accessible. So it's really critical that you do those kinds of things. And again, make sure there's language on all your meeting announcements about the need for any kind of accommodation, whether it be alternative formats, whether it be sign language, whether it be real-time captioning, whether it be assistive listening systems, etc. Make sure that whatever software you use for your surveys, so for example, Qualtrics is one that is used a lot by a lot of entities. Qualtrics has a setting in it that you can that whoever is your administrator can toggle to use the accessible version of Qualtrics versus the inaccessible version of Qualtrics. But that has to be toggled on. You can't do it as an individual, but whoever it controls your settings of your Qualtrics account has to do that for you to be able to make that an accessible survey. Things like radio buttons versus check buttons. Radio buttons are accessible, check buttons are not accessible. So just even what you choose and how somebody's going to respond on a survey makes a difference from an accessibility perspective. So whatever you're using, make sure that it's accessible. How do I know if it's accessible? That's what I get everybody asked all the time. Test it. Have somebody test it for accessibility. Have somebody that is a user test it. That's where engaging your public, etc. If you have an employee who's a screen reader user or somebody, have them test it for you. That's the best way to do it. Question, yes?
It's not really an important question per se. I'm just curious about your comment about the radio button versus the check. I know what you're talking about, like on a form. I'm just curious what the why is behind that.
It's the screen reader's technology to interface with that. So a radio button versus a check, I don't know what the code is that's in that, but a screen reader, which is the most prevalent thing used by people who are blind, is software that they have on their machine that will read it, has difficulty interfacing with a check mark option versus a radio button. I know it's a coding issue. It's a coding issue. Yep. Yeah, no problem. Any other questions about that? Yeah.
About something else. How many, do you find that most villages use a third party to help with community engagement, or they just do it all on their own?
So the question is, do we find that the communities use third parties to help them with community engagement, or they do that on their own? That's vastly different depending on the community and what they already have going on in their community as it relates to disability. So for example, I would assume that a community like Oak Park or Hoffman Estates, which already has a mayor's advisory committee, they already have a process by which they're engaging with the disability community, probably would not look to an outside, because I'll do that, but a community that doesn't have that experience, doesn't know where to start, may consider to contact. So for example, there are in the greater Chicago area, 6 centers for independent living, which are federally funded centers for independent living that are designed, they employ by law more than 61% of their staff and their board of directors are people with disabilities. And so it's basically people with disabilities helping people with disabilities. And their goal is to help people with disabilities live independently in the community, and they provide an array of services to do that. They are one of the best places we send communities to first to engage with, because they are already interacting across sector disability already, and they will help. And they oftentimes will work with your community, maybe for a fee, maybe for a not, to help you with that community engagement. That would be one of the first places I would start, kind of thing, if you were looking to do that kind of thing, if you didn't know where to start in your community. But yeah, I mean, definitely, hiring a third party, somebody who's well connected in the disability community to, help you, or a disability organization to help you, is another way to do it, for sure. And we've seen that done. We are putting together a resource list, or we've compiled quite a resource list already, of disability organizations and things like that in the Chicagoland area that CMAC will be posting on the website also. So you don't have to start from scratch. So, all right. Again, make sure that you test and you assure that your document. One of the best ways to check easy way to check a PDF document is use the read out loud feature that's available in Adobe Reader. that people have on their computers. If you engage the Read Out Loud and watch that document as it's reading, you'll get a really good baseline read as to whether or not your document is accessible. If the document, if the Read Out Loud is skipping all over the document, that means it's not accessible, because Read Out Loud reads based on headers and the levels, like first level, second level, third level, so titles, paragraphs, etc. And if you haven't structured that document accessible, the Read Out Loud will give you that indication right away. That's a really down and dirty way to check a PDF for accessibility. Again, want to make sure that you have community engagement at all stages across the process. So you want to make sure that you've engaged them at the planning phase. So you don't want to wait until the end. Oh yeah, we need to pull in people with disabilities. The mantra in the disability community is nothing about us without us. And that should be front and center to what you think about in regard to those kinds of things, is that don't make assumptions, don't bring them in after the fact, again, tokenism, etc. Engage them in the planning phase, engage them during, so the planning, I'm talking about the own planning. If we're a community that's going to start this process, we're just starting, we're getting ready, and what are we going to do, how are we going to do it, whatever, bring the disability community, at least some representation for the disability community in on that discussion, have a discussion with them, let them know what you're doing, what's going on. In the self-evaluation phase, where you're actually looking at all your programs, services, and activities, bring them in during that phase as well as your transition planning phase when you're doing your prioritization. Okay, you want to bring them in as that, and then you want to make sure that you don't just drop off and say, okay, we're done, we checked the boxes, we're done with you, we don't want to engage with you anymore. Make sure that you think of this as something that's ongoing. This is an ongoing engagement. We're going to continue to use this community as we have new projects that come up, as we have new activities that come up, as we're making progress on our plan. If we have to make changes, boops, something major comes up and we have to realign all together because of either some new monies comes in, so we're going to do something different, or a natural disaster has occurred, or something's happened that we've had to change what our original plan was, etc. Make sure that we're still engaging so that people know what's going on, and that this is an ongoing relationship that you have with them. Think of this as something that you have a new marriage, going forward, and you have a new relationship. Again, during the planning phase, you want to make sure that they're part of your goal development. You want to make sure that you use this as you're identifying the key groups you want to bring in along the way, and make sure that you understand that you want to be reaching out to them before they reach out to you. By the time they've reached out to you, it is probably because they're dissatisfied, or there's probably potentially a tension of some type or whatever. So you proactively reaching out to them is much better than waiting for them to reach out to you. Don't sit passively away and say, oh, they'll eventually come to us. Make sure you're being proactive. During this self-evaluation phase, you want to gather their insight. Again, have them help gather the data collection, what's important, etc. Get their feedback on that. Are you collecting the right data? Is the data relevant to the right areas of the city and the right issues that they want you to be looking at, especially in that self-evaluation? They'll help you identify the things that you potentially forgot about. Sometimes we don't think about all the nuances of a program, service, or activity until somebody with a disability starts to ask you about, well, what about communication for that, or what about the materials for that, or what about this or that's important to them that impacts their ability to participate in those programs, services, or activities. And again, their involvement and their engagement provide you some backup for future prioritization. You've now got a good sense of what they want, what they need, et cetera, in your prioritization process. And again, as Travis always likes to say, be prepared to be surprised. You might think you've got it all down. You might think you know everything. You might think you've got, a concept of everything that's going on, and just be prepared that, this group of individuals and what they bring forward and what is important to them that you haven't thought about could surprise you. Something that you thought is trivial could be very important to another group. And just because you haven't heard about it already doesn't mean it's not important. What I often hear is that, well, nobody ever says anything. We don't get calls about that. We don't get, whatever kind of thing. Well, you have to recognize that a person with a disability, depending on their disability, et cetera, lives with and deals with a lot of things on a day-to-day basis. And so they pick and choose where their battles are going to be. And maybe they've already had a battle about the curb cut in their neighborhood, or they've already had a battle about the sidewalk over on 2nd Street or whatever, and it went nowhere. And so you know what? They just gave up and moved on because they're sick and tired. They've made 1,000 calls. Nobody listens to them. They get dissed, or whatever type of a thing. That is a lot of what happens. And then they just give up, because the issue is it's not fair. Why do I, as a person with a disability, have to be more vocal? Why do I have to be constantly battling for issues and things of that nature just because of my disability? So that you need to understand that there is that mentality and that is that issue for people. They definitely know what inaccessibility impact is and what that experience is like, so that they bring that firsthand experience to you. When you're talking about levels and you're talking about, tolerances and things like that, they'll give you the insight about what those tolerances and what those levels mean, for sure for them, what that difference makes for them. Definitely engage them to assist with your prioritization. You may think one thing's top priority, but you're going to hear from the disability community, no, that intersection over at such and such is much more important than this one over here. They're both important, but this one is used more, but because you didn't know that the fact that there's 3 healthcare providers that people use frequently within a block of there, and so that's a more important intersection for them than this one over here, even though that one's important, but this one's more important. But you don't know why. And you get that feedback from them. So again, be prepared to be surprised. Ongoing engagement, again, see them as part of your team. The engagement should last as long as the barrier exists, and because we know that barriers will always exist, some barrier will always exist, again, ongoing engagement. And again, make sure that you are continuously reaching out, continuously feeding information back and forth, even to your underserved communities as well. Again, you don't want them to call, you want them to call you before they call somebody else, like the DOJ hotline, or the Equip for Equality, the legal assistance program for people with disabilities, in Illinois about a particular issue, or a private lawyer that might happen to be a family friend who will help them out, or more than happy to represent them in a particular issue. Make sure that you celebrate your progress. Make a big deal of it. Look at, hopefully your communities are doing things like recognize the ADA anniversary. We have, the ADA anniversary is a great time to recognize accomplishments of this type. Disability Employment Month is in October. Great time to also recognize things of that nature, because those are already identified months where the disability community is looking to do things. July is Disability Pride Month. So look at those kinds of things too as opportunities to celebrate your progress that you're making. Acknowledge that you have challenges. Be upfront about it. Acknowledge to the community that this is a challenge financially. This is a challenge for whatever reason it might be. We find that if people understand why it's a challenge and that there is a challenge, they are much less likely to be angry and to file complaints and things of that nature, because they've been informed. They've been brought along with the process. They understand how much it costs to do things. The average citizen doesn't understand what it costs to do a curb cut. Average citizen doesn't understand what it costs to do some of these things. But when you're engaged in the community and they know and they understand that we've got a budget, this impacts the tax dollars. You only have this much. We have prioritizations. It's not just about this. It's also about fire and safety and all the other things that are going on in the community. They much better understand the limitations, right? So if you keep them informed and engaged in that, and again, make sure you reflect the needs of the changing needs of your community. So if you're seeing, let's say, for example, you get a new group home that comes into your community of people with disabilities, that neighborhood where they're coming into is going to have potential different needs and different issues and things of that nature. Or if you have a new healthcare center that's going to be built or something of that nature, that's going to trigger different changes because of the usability of that area and the more frequency of that area by people with disabilities because of the nature of the healthcare and their use of healthcare services and such. So make sure that you're also aware of the fact that that you are constantly reflecting the changing needs of your community in general. There's a lot of information I just talked about in the community engagement and such. Are there any questions that I didn't answer or that you have or that I raised with you about this particular issue?
Okay, we're gonna get going again. I think on the community engagement, we threw a lot of stuff at you, and we understand that. Our goal is that you start doing something. And that whenever someone comes with a question, hopefully you think, oh, I did know something about this. There is someone in the community that I can reach out to. So in a perfect world, you do everything that we just talked about. But don't let the perfection of everything we just talked about stop you from starting. Because I think once you get started, it'll start building on itself and you'll be able to develop those relationships. And it gets easier over time. That is the one thing I'll tell you is once you develop the relationships, they'll start reaching out to you, and it's just going to make the whole community engagement process easier. Moving on, we're going to spend some time talking about prioritization. The first step in this is sort of answering the question of why prioritize. I don't know every single one of your communities. I am comfortable making an assumption that most of these communities, you're going to find 30, 40, 50, 60% of your pedestrian facilities are not truly ADA compliant. So in a perfect world, you fix everything immediately. You go in 1 year, you replace all your sidewalks, you're ADA compliant, you're done, you don't need a prioritization. In reality, the money just doesn't match the need, and the money's never going to match the need. So the question now becomes, how do I handle that asset? To us, we view sidewalks as an asset, just like you do your streets programs, your water valves, your fire hydrants, things of that nature. I'm sure a lot of you run Pacer or Paver or something like that for your streets, and that helps you in sort of what your street maintenance plan is. We kind of view sidewalks in a very similar fashion, in which at the end of the day, sidewalks are an asset to be managed, and what we want to do is identify those sidewalks that have the greatest impact on people. Because that's really what we're trying to do, is we're trying to allow people to get to where they want to go. Barrier removal is a long-term effort, so then the question becomes, how does the city village determine which barrier to remove first? As I said before, the first step in this, though, is that you have to know the scale of your problem. This is really where that barrier assessment survey, where the self-evaluation comes in, is it's hard to know what you need to prioritize if you don't know what you have. How do you go to your city council and say, we need to spend more money on sidewalks? The first question back to you is going to be, well, how much do we need to spend to make our sidewalks compliant? And your answer is going to be, well, we have no idea. We don't actually know what we have. So that's the whole discussion from yesterday, is we do all that work so that we can quantify what the challenge that we face is. And really what this does is this allows you to advocate for a dedicated funding source. The number doesn't need to be massive. The number is whatever works within your city or village's budget. But by having that good faith effort of the dedicated funding source, if anybody ever asks you, what are you doing about ADA? It allows you to answer that question of, this is where we're starting. And through our numbers, we know whether we need to increase that or whether that's a reasonable number. But what we're doing is that we're showing that good faith effort in our funding source. What barriers limit accessibility? So big thing here is each community is unique. The ADA is a very black and white law. It's either compliant or it's not compliant. For the world of like sidewalk cross slope, 1 in 50, compliant. 1 in 49, non-compliant. Those side from the eye, those are the exact same sidewalks. They look exactly the same. But from the perspective of the ADA, one's compliant, one's non-compliant. So the challenge is, how do we identify those barriers that we want to prioritize so that we're spending the money that is available in a way that truly impacts people? As Robin talked about with community engagement, what is a barrier to me may not be a barrier to you. And I think more importantly, what we assume is a barrier to the disability community may not actually be a barrier that really impacts them. As we go through this prioritization, this is the most important part, to me at least, in engaging the disability community, is as a village, you're going to come up with a prioritization system. And then at the end of the day, if you can't explain how this prioritization system helps people, then you haven't really prioritized anything. So I think this is where that community engagement can really be used to prioritize your assets, because ultimately the question is, how do we stand behind our decisions? Because people are going to question. Everybody wants the sidewalk fixed in front of their house. You know, that's always the first question is, well, why did you fix their sidewalk and not my sidewalk? If the answer is, I don't know, we chose a sidewalk, that's one thing. Or if the answer is, this is a top priority because it connects a high-density housing unit to a school, there's no bus access, therefore this is what we decided to prioritize as a city. This is where we think our pedestrian dollars need to be spent. They're not going to agree with your decision, but it's going to be a lot harder to challenge your decision whenever you have a reason for what you did. It's an opportunity to make the public part of the team. We've already hit on this a lot, but the challenge of knowing the barriers that someone with a disability face, you're never going to be able to answer that question until you ask them that question. As we already talked about, there are options to generate feedback. We talked about the online surveys, paper surveys, all that good stuff. But while community feedback is important in the prioritization process, it can't be the only component. Because I'll ask the question, I'll just ask in your guys' sort of normal everyday work lives. Whenever you guys host public meetings, whenever you guys do this engagement, who do you guys struggle to reach? I don't need anybody to answer, but just take a second to think about that. A lot of communities, you get the same people out to every single meeting. You get the squeaky wheels coming out and taking part in your engagement process. But are you really reaching everybody in your community? So if the answer is we're going to let the community guide everything, what's actually happening most of the time is that a very narrow sliver of the community is now setting the policy for the entirety of the community. So there is still work on your guys' end to look at and say, okay, this doesn't feel right, or I need to reach out to this community, to this group, because they aren't taking part in this process and I want their opinion. So we talk a lot about community engagement and how important it is, but at the end of the day, it has to be right for your community. It has to, if it doesn't feel right, it's probably not right. So I want to spend a little bit of time on sort of the prioritizing barriers to access. There are going to be a series of pictures up here, and each one of them is something that's not compliant. It's something that is wrong with a sidewalk. We'll take a minute or so, I'll explain the pictures, and then if someone wants to raise their hand and state what they think is the highest priority, that'd be fantastic. And I think hopefully we can get in a bit of discussion on sort of how this prioritization process goes back and forth. So picture number one here, which I don't think I have a laser pointer. Ooh, I do. So picture number one here is a trip hazard. This is a sidewalk that's heaved up because there's a tree root over here. So this is probably about 1 inch tall, trip hazard. Over here, this is poor surface quality. It's a broken sidewalk. There are little 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch vertical displacements all along here. This is one of our wonderful utility companies who decided that what they needed to do was drop a power pole directly in the middle of the sidewalk. And lastly, this is an entrance in which the cross slope across that entrance is incredibly steep. So if someone is willing to raise their hand and say sort of which one matters most to them, I would greatly approve it. I would definitely appreciate it. Eve, you got a hand down here.
I would say the trip hazard, just because people can get injured and there's liability on the city or village's part, I think greater than any of the other instances.
Yeah, so your trip hazard, because number one, liability, and number two, I'll say it's a bit more of a hidden hazard. Does that kind of, like, you know, you can see the power pole. There's a good chance that you're not going to see the trip hazard. Anybody else have any other thoughts? You're gonna get your steps in today.
I always do.
Okay, I don't think we'll know unless we ask the disability group, like we've been learning, but I would think the steep cross slope, if there's someone on a wheelchair and just flips over. That's just my opinion. I would obviously ask
Yeah.
the group.
Anybody else have any other thoughts? Anything else that they'd like to share? So the honest answer is both of you guys are completely right. Like both are completely valid thoughts. And one of them is, takes into account the risk assessment. The other one takes into account the wheelchair community and the impacts on that. And I think that's where we want that broad feedback so that we can learn sort of what really matters. And that as we prioritize, we can use that prioritization to kind of flush out those areas that are the greatest impact. And it might be a situation in which the insurance component of that, the public's not going to know about the insurance liability issue, correct? That's not something that's really going to be publicly available to them.
They do know about it.
Okay, so they do know about it. Yeah. So they are aware of it. So then, all that feeds into the prioritization. Because at the end of the day, all four of these barriers exist, and you might not be able to fix all four of them at once. But what we find works really well is if you're very transparent as to how you're going to prioritize, it helps in explaining whenever someone says, there's a power pole here. How can you not fix this power pole? And you can say, well, we prioritized for this reason, and we're fixing ADA issues in our city. But these are our high priority issues, and we're going to get to the power pole. We just might not get to it today. Moving on, the question to ask, this is sort of a rhetorical question. Who in your community uses the sidewalk network? The honest answer is everybody. Everybody uses the sidewalk network, and they all use it for different things. There are people in your community who use the sidewalk network to get from their house to their job. Is that a different priority than someone in your community who likes to go for a 2-mile walk every day? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But you need to know who's using your sidewalk network and ultimately where are they trying to get to. Because this is going to be the biggest challenge when it comes to this ADA transition plan and looking at your self-evaluation, is how do you compare sidewalk shared use pathways across your community? Whenever 50% of your community is non-compliant and you have money in your budget to fix 5% of your community, how do you identify that 5% that provides the greatest value? How do you identify that 5% that meets the goals of the Public Works Department, of your leadership? Because your leadership's going to play a role in this. What is the political pressure on fixing that 5%? That may match up with the community. It may not match up with the community. Hopefully it does, but I'm not going to guarantee that it always does. So next up here is prioritizing sidewalks. And for this, we're going to have a conversation about where people in your community are trying to go. So we've answered sort of question number 1, which is what are those barriers to access that impacts people's ability to get around? The next question is question number 2, which is where are they trying to go? And the reason we dive into this is because you can have a really poor situation on the back of a cul-de-sac. That's a non-compliant sidewalk. But is that a higher priority than fixing the sidewalk that's not ADA compliant in your downtown area? I think we'd all agree that fixing that downtown sidewalk is more important, but how do we justify that decision?
That could be in front of a resident's house that needs to access it with a wheelchair or something like that.
Which we'll get into that conversation later. So, what? Oh, sorry. So what the lady mentioned is that may not be necessarily true, because if that's in someone's house, in front of someone's house who has a wheelchair, then that could change that prioritization. And just sort of a sneak peek as to what's coming out ahead in our presentation, we're going to go through this whole conversation, and then we're going to talk about how grievances change this discussion. So we go through this. This is very much our big picture planning operation. But whenever we start getting grievances in from the community, that changes our conversation. And the honest answer why is because they're reaching out to you. They've taken the time to reach out to you. So obviously this is an important issue for them. And since it's an important issue for them, these are just admittedly the people who are most likely to continue to have that be an important issue for them. Whether it's calling the leadership, whether it's calling the Attorney General's office, their lawyer, whoever that might be, the honest answer is that is an immediate concern that you need to address. It might not mean that you fix their problem, but you do need to coordinate with that community member. So going back to the broad big picture perspective, this is Naperville, and I identified a whole bunch of assets that exist around sort of the downtown Naperville area. We got trails, we got bus stops, we got schools, we got high density housing, downtown, city hall, hospital, all that good stuff. There's a lot of things in this area that people are trying to get to, but everything can't be a priority. Everything can't be the top priority. Because if our entire city is the top priority, then how are we going to be able to prioritize? So sort of the same exercise as last time. Does anybody want to provide some feedback on sort of what they would consider to be the top priority in this picture? Oh, we got a hand in the back.
I don't know what I would choose would be the high priority out of those things based on my personal opinion, but I know how I go about trying to answer that question.
Absolutely, fantastic.
Any of my like project manager, architect, engineering types in the room have probably gone through some sort of QBS process or participated in that, and I think that type of approach to this would be a great way to solve this, which is, essentially you take your stakeholder group, whoever your decision maker group is, and you establish sort of like a survey of what your priorities are and a ranking system on each one of those priorities so that you can sort of weight them on each one and use that to sort of come up with a scoring system. And then you can apply that scoring system, and that way you've got like a non-arbitrary measuring system to apply to these things. I mean, that's how I would personally.
No, for sure, absolutely. So in this case, let's assume we're all residents of Naperville and we are that stakeholder group. So that's sort of the exercise that I want to do here is you guys are not all engineers, public works directors, whoever you might be. You guys are all residents who live in Naperville. Which one of these to you personally would be the highest priority?
The one in front of my house.
The one in front of your house. You're not wrong. So what the gentleman said is that the one in front of his house is the highest priority. Yeah, not wrong. Eve, your thoughts?
I would say the Metro because transit riders disproportionately don't have a higher percentage of disabilities as well as non-car usage.
Yeah, so here we have someone who has a bit of knowledge and is applying that knowledge to their answer. Whereas the first answer was in front of my house because that's what's important to me. On the other hand, someone's answer is, well, I know that this community uses Metro more and that therefore that is a higher priority to the community. Again, they're both absolutely correct answers. And this is where we need that broad stakeholder group in order to answer those questions. Because if we only ask 3 or 4 people, and the 3 or 4 people just happen to be my house people, then that's the way that we're gonna go. Or the 3 or 4 people could be the Metro people. And then all of a sudden you have a prioritization system that is based around Metro as the highest priority. So that's really where we need to broaden out that group. Because again, there's no wrong answer. I think so many times in engineering we're looking for the right answer. IDOT tells us what we have to do. FHWA tells us the process that we have to do to get environmental clearances or whatever that might be. For this, it's a little different because there's 1,000 different right answers. And the appropriate right answer is the right answer for your community. So, and kind of like the gentleman in the back mentioned, at the end of the day, this is about documentation. Because you could go through this whole process and someone could completely disagree with the final decision that you came to. And they're not necessarily wrong, but have a process that you could stand behind. And also have a process in which you acknowledge that these things are going to change over time. If a major development comes in and someone builds a 20-story building on the edge of your town, all of a sudden you've added a lot more residents to that side of the town. At that point, maybe the prioritization changes. You know, if you're a growing community that's adding subdivisions, and really if you're adding schools. If you're a growing community that's adding schools, that prioritization is going to shift as those school boundaries shift. So however you're going to prioritize, understand that similar to how everything at ADA is always sort of shifting a little bit, your priorities are going to shift as your community changes. So examples of what we could look at: government buildings, parks, schools, public transportation, commercial development, medical facilities are a big one. You know, the disability community, the aging community, basically anybody who's using a medical facility, there's a good chance that they might be not the strongest walker. Senior living facilities, again, same idea. The aging community, we want to encourage them to get out and walk so they can be part of our priorities. High density housing, you know, a lot of people in tight spaces. And lastly, high volume roadways. The reason I include high volume roadways is due to the danger of not having that accessibility. On a local street in a subdivision, we don't want anybody to have to go into the street, but they can probably do that fairly safely. On Dyer Road, if someone has to walk in the street, they're taking their life in their hands at that point. So I think that is a valid prioritization that we can look at, is what is the impact on vehicular traffic on the pedestrian traffic that's adjacent to us. The other big thing that you can dive into, if you choose to, is socioeconomic data. That data is freely available. You can get a feel for where those under-resourced communities are at in your city. Information that's generally relatively available is people with disabilities, zero-car households, employment centers, where are people going to work in your community, and lastly, individuals over 65. The disadvantages of this, because I think it's important to acknowledge the potential disadvantages, is number one, how good is the data that you get? It's how good the data is going to be based on somebody else. This isn't data that you're going to be able to collect. You're using someone else's data. Lastly, we tend to get this data in census blocks, which is just larger squares. So it might be a case in which the impact of a small part of that census block is actually impacting the entirety of the census block. So if you are going to dive into socioeconomic data, which I do think is very good, use your knowledge of the community to back up what that census data is telling you. Because the census data is very good at sort of broad views of your community, but you're really going to need to be able to hone in on sort of where you know your community has these challenges. So going back to complaint-driven prioritization. The big advantage of it is that it meets the needs of the engaged community. As we already talked about, if someone cares enough to call to you, that's something that needs to be considered. However, I would advocate against having that be your only version of prioritization. Because the honest answer is under-resourced communities are less likely to submit complaints. They're less likely to reach out to you. And if we do everything on a complaint-driven basis, then who we're addressing is the people who reached out. So we did the ADA transition plan for the city of St. Louis. 300,000 people, very diverse community. We did a public survey. We got back 7,000 results on our online survey. Of those, 90% of them came from 4 neighborhoods in the city of St. Louis, and 10% of them came from the other 200,000 people who live in the city of St. Louis. So if we followed that as our prioritization would be those 4 communities. Because as you mentioned, they were focused on their issues. But as a city, you have that obligation to take care of everybody. Because if word gets out that the only way to get something done in your city is to complain, then what's going to be people's solution to getting something done for themselves? Complain. It's the only option that you've given them. So then you're going to get more complaints, and then at some point you're going to have to start prioritizing complaints because you're not going to have enough money to follow the complaints. The other challenges that I think this leads to is addressing individual barriers to access over community barriers to access. you're fixing individuals' problems, whenever maybe the goal is to more do a community-wide increasing overall accessibility. The honest answer is complaint-driven is going to be part of this process. We can never just completely ignore the complaints. But I think it's important that the complaints get processed through the overall goals of the plan. So that it's never just all, because what I hope you don't get out of this is that you can say, I'm not going to fix your sidewalk because my plan doesn't say to fix your sidewalk. Because that's certainly not the right answer. But I also don't think the right answer is just to say, we're only going to fix what people call and complain about. In reality, it's going to be a bit of both, in which you're taking care of some individual needs while continuing that broad push for accessibility. With that, Robin, you are up.
Thank you. So we switch our little microphones here. All right. I'm going to talk about the steps for a transition plan, just so we kind of have an idea. And again, a lot of this kind of melds together as we're talking, but hopefully by separating some of this out, it clarifies some things specifically for you. So, oops, it's not advancing. Okay, use this. All right, so when you look at developing a transition plan, make sure, again, that it encompasses all the entirety of your programs and services throughout the city and village. We're going to be focusing today on the public rights-of-way and such, but understand that the transition plan is not just about your public rights-of-way. It is the entire entity itself. So every building, every facility, et cetera, needs to be part of that transition plan. And again, the rule of thumb is any area that the public engages. So I think yesterday we had somebody asked about the water treatment plant, and so the water treatment plant is doesn't need to be part of your transition plan because it's not an area that's open to the public unless you do tours or something of that nature. So for example, we get a lot of questions about, well, do firehouses or fire department, firehouses, are they required to be part of your transition plan and stuff of that nature? One of my first questions is your fire department used for anything? Is it an area of shelter during emergency? Does it host school groups for tours and things of that nature, of the firehouse, et cetera? If it does, any of those areas that the public would come into, that they engage with the public as part of the firehouse, needs to be part of that self-evaluation and transition plan. Okay, so even those things that you think about, well, they don't need to be, they do if, again, the rule of thumb is anywhere that the public engages or that you offer a program or service that the public is invited into or participates in. We're going to talk about guidance related to what should be included and go through 7 steps of developing a transition plan. All right, so again, every aspect of community government, some of the things, again, to consider, some examples, all municipal facilities, buildings, properties, parks, etc. Always be that rule of thumb is, where does the public engage? Where do we host or hold events? Even if it's one time a year. So you might have one time a year that you have the recycling for Christmas trees. And you only hold it one time a year for that period. For that one time a year, that area is open to the public. That area is part of your program, services, and activities and should be on your list of things that you address in your self-evaluation and transition plan. Even though the rest of the time, that area is not used. But the fact that you do use it for that one activity that's open to the public, it now needs to be included in your self-evaluation and transition plan because that's an activity or a program that you have open to the public. Make sure you include your accessible information technology. This means your websites. This means your cable stations or any streaming services that you are doing or offering. So if you are having council meeting here today and you are also streaming it live out into the public and you've done your due diligence in advance, is anybody going to be attending that's going to need a sign language interpreter or real-time captioner? You don't get any requests for that, so you don't have it for the meeting. However, you're streaming it out into the public. Now it's open to anybody who can dial into that channel at any time. I don't have to show up here in person to attend that meeting. So now you have to address that issue. What's the accessibility of that streaming service for anybody that can dial at any time turn on that channel. That needs to be accessible. Minimally, real-time captioning for that. So again, you need to address these issues and what you're doing, what you're not doing. Do you have any payment systems? Are you using a third-party payment vendor on your website for paying water bills or things of that nature? Whatever. Have you contracted and you've done a plugin or whatever on your website? Do you know that that plugin is accessible or not? Just because it is a third party does not mean you don't have obligations. You're using it to conduct your programs and services. So you're obligated to use a vendor that's accessible. If you have a kiosk somewhere in City Hall or elsewhere in the community, that kiosk better be accessible if it's run and operated by the city and part of the city. Again, make sure that all of your policies are accessible, your police, your city council, how they run things, and your vendors, your procurement process. Make sure that your procurement process is accessible. And what I mean by that is, do you have language in your procurement process that assures that you're only purchasing goods and services that are accessible and you're only using vendors that don't discriminate against people with disabilities? You are liable for that third-party vendor if they are doing or performing a service on your behalf. You don't abdicate your responsibility because you're using a third party. So this is where your law department stuff comes into play. What kind of language do we have? But it's not just having the language. It's not just doing it, but do your departments follow it? Are they making sure when they're making the purchase of the new telephone system, if they're making the purchase of the new chairs, the new tables, the new whatevers, are they taking into consider accessibility proactively in doing that? And then is somebody verifying and checking it? I can tell you, I work for the University of Illinois. We contracted externally for a system that you could use that was an app for our phones that would notify us of emergencies and things of that nature that they use for lockdowns and all kinds of things on campus. Bought it, had it programmed, did whatever, launched it to all of us, totally inaccessible to people who are blind, low vision. It was in the procurement contract, but nobody validated it when they took delivery of the product. And then they launched it, and boy, did they have egg on their face after the fact. In fact, it resulted in a $15,000 settlement agreement with an employee who was blind. It was not enough to have the language in their procurement contract. You got to also follow through with that and validate that you're getting what you paid for, or you're getting what you're holding your contractor to what you've put in your language in your contract. All of this needs to be in your self-evaluation transition plan. Other examples, your emergency procedures. Are your temporary shelters, whether or not you contract that to be done, if you contract with local churches, you contract with other entities to run these for you, are they accessible? If it's done on behalf of the city or the village, it has a responsibility. It's your responsibility. What are your emergency procedures for evacuation? Are you taking into consideration transportation? Are you taking into consideration transportation of people in wheelchairs? Are you taking consideration transportation of their equipment and stuff with them that they may need? What about the care of their service animals, etc.? All of that is part of your self-evaluation. Temporary events, whether they are held by you or sponsored by you, are covered. So all those farmers markets and all of those fairs and things that might happen in your villages where you shut down streets and you do different things, you might collaborate with the business community or Parks and Rec or whoever else. Those are all part of your program, services, and activities being looked at, because if your name is associated with it, if it is on your property, etc., you've got liability. And again, our focus as we go forward today with more discussions primarily of public works, but we would be remiss not to remind you that it encompasses more than just your public works activities. This is to be a living document. I think we've reinforced that a couple of times already, talking about the fact that it is a tool to be used. That means it needs to be updated, that needs to be kept current, recognizing it's going to change. That's why don't do it in ink, so that you know that it's going to change. And make sure that you have a process in place that you make your documents available to the public to review. That transparency is really important. that they know what you're doing, where you're going, what's changed, what's being updated, where you're at with it, what's the progress. I'm gonna go through here, myself and Travis, the steps of an ADA transition plan. ADA coordinator, designating the ADA coordinator, providing notice to the public, establishing a grievance procedure, developing ADA internal standards, completing the self-evaluation, approving a schedule and budget, monitoring the progress of the plan, and updating the plan for progress and new barriers. And we're going to talk about each one of those. So, designating the ADA coordinator. We had a whole session. How many of you attended the session on ADA coordinator? A few of you did? Okay. So really critical piece of it. Again, typically the ADA coordinator, again, it doesn't have to be called an ADA coordinator. There's nothing in the ADA in the law that says it's called an ADA coordinator. Under the ADA, in the regulations for Title II, it says designated employee. What you call it, it's just often referred to as ADA coordinator. It could be something else. Okay? They typically oversee all aspects of the municipality. In the ADA, the regulations are that the highest authority in the municipality is ultimately responsible, but they can designate an employee, which is the ADA coordinator typically, to have responsibility for the implementation of those things. But the buck stops at the top. When somebody has got a complaint or is filing a complaint or filing a court case, it is not ADA coordinator versus them. It is city of or mayor of or whatever versus them. Okay? So, again, but ADA implementation responsibilities include sidewalks and ramps, government buildings, all programs and services, accessible information technology, public meetings, etc., as we've already talked about. Different models are used for ADA coordinator. For some communities, they have a primary ADA coordinator, and then they have liaisons in each of their departments because one person can't possibly often, especially in larger municipalities, know everything that's going on. And sometimes we'll find the ADA coordinator in HR, and I will be the first to tell you that an HR person knows nothing about maintenance and roads and infrastructure and things of that nature. But they may be the designated ADA coordinator. It's really critically important that you look at, is it for your municipality better to have liaisons that report in or have a committee that represents the different major elements of your community, et cetera? There is no required structure. The issue is there needs to be some place for people to come to with ADA issues and somebody who's making the ultimate decision about what gets done and what the response to that issue is. Under Illinois, this is an Illinois-specific requirement. It does not exist anywhere else. Illinois legislature passed a piece of legislation that says all municipalities that have a website must post the name, office, address, and telephone number of the ADA coordinator, if any, and the grievance procedures, if any, that were adopted by the municipality to resolve ADA complaints. So if you don't have this on your website already, you're out of compliance with the state of Illinois rule and regulation. Okay? This is specific to Illinois law only. Best practice is to have it, but Illinois codified it. We strongly recommend a liaison within the Public Works Department to serve as the responsible person for ADA implementation in your department with very defined responsibilities related to that, and to report to and coordinate with the ADA coordinator. One of the key things who's responsible for the documentation? Is it the ADA coordinator? Is it liaison? How is that kept? How is that updated? Who's ultimately responsible? Is it a shared drive? How is that done? Because when or if a lawyer comes knocking, got a FOIA request, Department of Justice comes knocking, whoever, you better know where to get that information and where that information is and who's maintaining it. Second, provide notice to the public about ADA. This is an obligation under the ADA that remains. Notice to the public can be anything you want it to be. The Department of Justice provides a standard template. We're providing you a link to that template, and must include the name and contact info for ADA coordinator. Now, it does not have to have Joe Smith is ADA coordinator. It just needs to have identified that there is an ADA coordinator and how to contact that person. A lot of times municipalities don't want to put the person's name on there because it might be a rotating thing or it might change often, and so I have to update your website all the time, whatever, but you need to have the contact information. Many municipalities will have a generic email for the ADA coordinator, ADA coordinator at community.com, or .il or whatever, so that, that it's not specific to, it's an email that goes to maybe multiple people, for addressing or whatever. It's just that you have to have contact information on there. This is a sample just pulled from the, I liked this one. It's from the city of Crystal Lake. Their notice that's on their website. And again, it's just a sample to take a look at. You can see that they go right through and talk about all of their issues of access and equality, et cetera, in their notice, from employment to goods and services to communication to modifying policies, practices, and procedures. So they're pretty detailed in their notice to the public and how then to get in touch with somebody if you have issues with any of these particular issues. And again, when you get the PowerPoint, you'll see there'll be a hyperlink to all of this information for you. Third, establish a grievance procedure. We're going to talk a lot more, as Travis said, about the grievance procedure and the process and how it can be used, proactively reactively, but in a proactive manner. But you do need to have a grievance procedure. Now, the ADA doesn't say you have to have a separate grievance procedure for ADA. You could already have a grievance procedure in your municipality for overall issues, about, tree removal or about whatever. It just needs to be made clear that grievance procedure also can be used and should be used for ADA purposes. Some municipalities find that general one doesn't work for ADA, and so they develop a separate one. There is no obligation legally that you have to do that. You have to have a grievance procedure, and you have to let the public know it's available. That's what the ADA says. The Department of Justice also has a model grievance procedure available, and again, you'll have a hyperlink to that. Again, it includes the information about who do you contact if related to this for ADA-related issues, and this is just an image of that grievance procedure that the Department of Justice has laid out. Again, they have very specific time frames in there, how long they'll take for review, how long you'll get read back. That's what a good grievance procedure does. It lets the public know what to expect, not just say, file a complaint with this, we'll eventually hear it, and go away. Type of thing. You really need to have prescribed procedures and then follow those procedures. How many days are you going to respond in stuff? Even if the response in the 15 days is, we're still working on it. You still need to be responding and still need to be acting and let the public know how that grievance will be handled. Okay? And we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a minute. And I'm going to turn it back over to Travis. Sorry, this thing is so small.
So, especially if you're just starting this process, these last sort of 4 steps that we're going to talk about here, that's a long-term effort. I think those first 3 things we mentioned, those can be done in the next month. And if you don't have them, I'd encourage you to focus on those 3 things first. Look into, do you have an ADA coordinator? There's a good chance that you have an ADA coordinator and you don't even know who that ADA coordinator is. Because in order for them to get money from the Illinois Arts Council, they appointed an ADA coordinator 5 years ago, but never told anybody that person was the ADA coordinator. It's possible that you have the notice to the public, but you can't find it anywhere. Again, everything else is sort of that long-term planning process. These first 3 things on the list are all things that can be done outside of the plan. If you're going to do a long-term planning, that's great. But if you're looking for where to start in this process, those first 3 things, this PowerPoint is going to be posted on CMAP's website, so you can get that link to the example grievance procedure. You can get that link to the notice to the public. You can go over what it means to assign an ADA coordinator. So if you get nothing out of today, please get those 3 things done as soon as you possibly can, and that is the best first step that we can give you in this process. So, next step on this is to develop ADA internal standards. So, the first question we got to ask ourselves is what standards are needed? Related to the ADA, can anybody think of where we need to have standards within our community for ADA?
Probably for sidewalk ramp, pedestrian ramp.
For pedestrian ramps, for new construction. Every time that we build something new, we need to know what that standard is. That being said, we don't need to reinvent the IDOT standards. If we're good with the IDOT standards, I'm not telling you that you have to develop your own standards. But what you need to do is say, in the community of Aurora, we expect you to follow the IDOT standards when you're building anything within the city. So, number one, new construction. That applies to street work. You know, when the city is designing a new street, when the city contractor comes out to build that work, all that work that's done needs to be ADA compliant. Also on that list, private development. Because ultimately, I'm making an assumption here, but if I'm misstating someone, please let me know. Most of the time, the city takes ownership of that subdivision after it's built. So at the end of the day, that's part of your network. And what you don't want to be doing is assuming somebody else's problem. Because if there's a lawsuit 10 years from now, are you going to be able to go back to that developer and say, you built it wrong, you owe the city money? Probably not. That's going to be a challenge. But it's still your responsibility. So if you don't have a process in place for ensuring something is ADA compliant before you take ownership of that from the developer, please look into how you can get that passed through your city. Commercial development. Whenever you do commercial development and they do improvements to the public right-of-way, at the end of the day, you also take ownership of that public right-of-way. No matter who's doing work within your right-of-way, at the end of the day, it's your right-of-way. So whatever that process is, so that you make sure that what they're building ultimately meets ADA. Because if it's not, it's going to end up in your ADA transition plan and you're going to have to pay to fix it. Another question, and looking at plans, this varies wildly, but I think it's a really good way to sort of kickstart public right-of-way improvements, is what's expected during redevelopment. Whenever someone is redeveloping a commercial development, are they required to do the sidewalks next to that commercial development? Are they required to do the curb ramps? This could be a tricky issue because a lot of times cities don't want to put additional responsibilities on the developers. But if you're open to that, that's a good way for somebody else to start improving your pedestrian network. As long as you're assessing it and making sure that it's compliant, you're leveraging those private dollars to help you improve it. And if they're not, that's perfectly fine, but make sure that they're not leaving it worse than what it is. As they drive those construction vehicles over, that they're not creating a worse problem. So for commercial development, that is very much a village by village situation. But I do think it's worth looking in your code and seeing how commercial development can be used to increase pedestrian accessibility. Additional standards that we would suggest to have. Utility work. When utilities come into your community and do work, what's your process for making sure that they're leaving the public right of way, that they're leaving those pedestrian assets better than what they found it? That includes restoration of site. What we find a lot in our ADA assessments is that especially vertical displacements can often be linked back to those utility trenches. They'll come in, they'll do their patch, but 4 or 5 years later, that patch is settled below the sidewalk because they didn't put rock underneath it, they didn't build it exactly correct. But now that's part of your ADA transition plan. That's part of your responsibility to fix. So what's the process that you can set up so that you're getting high quality work back whenever people do work in your right of way? This is a big one. Construction closures. We have detour routes for vehicles. Do we have detour routes for pedestrians? Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes is the right answer. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. And honestly, I'll say sometimes they're appropriate and sometimes they might not be needed. It kind of depends on the job. But what I would advocate against would be closing the sidewalk on both sides of the road at the exact same time and not providing any access. So during the construction process, are we thinking about how pedestrians are going to get through this road? You know, we spend all this time thinking about cars. We come up with elaborate detour plans and maintenance of traffic. And then for pedestrians, we say, they'll figure it out. They know where to walk to. But I think it's worth giving it some of that thought process and telling the contractors what the city expects of them. Is the expectation that contractors are going to have some version of pedestrian access at all times? I think that's a fair thing to put on the contractor. And if they can't meet it, they can always come back to you and ask for an exemption. They can always say, we can't do it for this reason. But I think there's value in setting that high threshold and then negotiating off that threshold if it's appropriate for what you're doing. Strongly encourage you to review your current code and ordinances. What existing standards are referenced? Countless times I've seen for public rights of way that the official code of the village or city is the 2010 ADA standards. There's no mention of PROAG at all in the city standards. So whenever a developer comes in, they are arguing that, well, I only have to meet the 2010 ADA standards because, you know, that's what your city or village says. But then you've got the federal standards for PROAG, which are best management practices. If you weren't here yesterday, quick little break on PROAG. PROAG is still guidelines. It has not made it through the Department of Justice process yet, but it is best management practices for the US DOT and for IDOT. So for that reason, we strongly encourage all communities to make PROAG their appropriate guidelines for public rights-of-way. It is starting the long, slow process of getting federal approval, but admittedly, we're not there yet. And they started this process in 2004? Yeah, so 2004, so we'll see whenever this gets done by. But with that being said, that would be what we'd advocate for, is for building everything to PROAG within your public rights-of-way. What specific requirements are listed? Something else that we've seen is the city or the village wants to do something very specific in their community. And they made that an ADA requirement in 1993. Since then, the ADA standards have changed. So one example of this is, it was a community that I worked with in Missouri in which they decided they were going to be proactive, and they put in their own ADA parking regulations. You know, for every 50 spots, you needed to have one ADA parking space. They did this in like the late 80s. They decided that they wanted to be proactive, but what we found whenever we looked at their plan in 2023, the actual code of ordinances was less accessible than the federal government's revised ADA parking standards. So what happened is a developer came in and said, I built everything to your code, what did I do wrong? And they had to come back and say, well, our code didn't actually meet federal codes. So it's important whenever you decide to add your own ADA regulations, nothing wrong with that. Just make sure that they're more stringent than the state or federal requirements. Also strongly advocate for you to have some form of disclaimer in there that says if federal or state is a more stringent requirement, follow those. What's your process for design exceptions? I handed this out yesterday. If anybody wasn't here yesterday, I have copies of that, of maximum extent practicable forms, in which you can document and say, we are not meeting ADA on this job, and this is why we're not meeting ADA. These are taken from the IDOT forms that they use on their state highway system. And all it is there was a utility pole there, a retaining wall, we couldn't relocate it, so we're providing ADA on the other side of the road. It's that documentation process, because the honest answer is people move around, people forget, and ADA issues are often not 1 month after a job's built. It comes up 5, 6, 7 years after a job's built, and if the person who made that decision isn't there, how are we going to argue that whenever someone has the complaint? Whenever someone says, why did you do this? Now you can pull out a piece of paper and say, we did it for these reasons. It's possible that those reasons can be challenged, but at least you know where you stood at that time. So whenever we take our next break, if you didn't get a copy of that yesterday, please come up and see either me or Robin, and we'll have copies of those forms for you guys. Lastly, what are the applicable codes? If there's federal funding or state funding involved, just that knowledge that IDOT or the federal government is going to have a say in the issue. This is my own personal suggestion. Use public standards whenever feasible. IDOT has fully vetted ADA standards. They're fantastic 99% of the time, so don't be afraid to use their standards, and then modify as appropriate. And lastly, as we talked about a little bit, who is responsible for revising those standards, your standards, when the federal or state standards change? The answer is the local community. The federal government isn't going to come out and say, all local standards that don't meet this are now considered not appropriate. It's on the local community to make sure that any special standards that they have meet the federal or state standards as they change. I talked about this a little bit. ADA parking spaces can share an access aisle. So Illinois Accessibility Code revised this requirement in 2018. Pre-2018, every single ADA parking space had to have its own private access aisle. When the new accessibility code came out in 2018, it now mimics the 2010 ADA standards in which they could share an access aisle. There is still a difference on the width of those ADA parking spaces. For the 2010 ADA standards, they allow you to go down to 13 feet? 11 feet? 13 feet.
For a regular.
Yeah, for a regular ADA parking space, they allow you to go down to 13 feet. Illinois Accessibility Code requires 16 feet for every ADA parking space, which is the van accessible parking regulations.
But you don't need a van accessible sign.
Yep, you don't need a van accessible sign, you just need to provide that 16-foot difference. However, what we've seen a lot is that since that exceeds the ADA requirements for the 2010 ADA standards, it creates confusion with developers. So it's really important as you go through that review process, because the developer is going to say, I'm meeting federal code. What am I doing wrong? And if you don't know that the state code exists, you've now approved a design that doesn't meet the applicable state codes. And especially on private development, we've seen this a couple times in which they've come back and said, you approved something that's not ADA compliant. What are you going to do about it? That's a conversation that none of us want to have. So that's just an example of where we need to know where the state code different. Parking tables, already talked about this, but just making sure, and my honest suggestion is just use the 2010 ADA standards. Unless you have a really passionate reason for why you want to have more stringent ADA parking standards, you use the 2010 ADA standards and then you're good to go. Example number 2, a village that we were working with required the 2010 ADA standards for sidewalk construction. They said all sidewalk on public right-of-way has to meet the 2010 ADA standards. They had no reference to the PROAG. So what that means is that they had no use of the road grade exception. For those of you that don't know, the PROAG allows the sidewalk to match the grade of the road, even if it's greater than 5%. So what that community ended up having to build for their for a developer's sidewalk was a sidewalk that was 5% landing, 5% landing, 5% landing for 2 miles of sidewalk. It looks ridiculous. It makes no sense, it's not usable, and it's only just because they didn't have their codes right. So look through your codes and make sure that they're good. The other thing is the 2010 ADA standards have no requirement to construct truncated domes. And then ultimately, when you need to coordinate with IDOT, you're going to have to follow IDOT standards and what they require separately. So I think these internal standards are really important because all the rest of our time is going to be spent on the past. Past mistakes, where sidewalks have broken down over time and how we're going to fix those. But what we don't want to have to do is spend our money on the future. If we build everything properly from here on out, we're going to save ourselves time and money. So that's where looking at these standards and codes is really important, is to make sure that we can focus on the past and to have a confidence that what we build in the future is going to be accessible. Completing the self-evaluation. That was entirely what yesterday was based on. The PowerPoint for yesterday will be posted up there. So if you have any questions about that, please refer to the PowerPoint. If you have specific questions today, certainly more than welcome to answer and ask those during our Q&A time. But really what the self-evaluation does is that it supports the development of the transition plan. The self-evaluation is not the final step. It's the first step in planning for what you're going to do in the future, because ultimately you can't plan unless you know what you have. Does anybody have any questions on the self-evaluation process before we move on? Not seeing any, we will continue on. So step 6 of the ADA transition plan is approving a schedule and budget. The goal here is not to have a planning document that is going to sit. I refer to it as we get a lot of them that collect dust. They go through all this process, they pay all the money, and then it sits up on a bookcase and no one actually uses it. So in order to use it, you need to assign a schedule and budget. You need to say, this is what us as the city, us as the village, is committed to moving forward. And one of the big things about that is that, as we talked about before, this is a public document. So you're making your schedule and budget publicly available. So give some thought to this schedule and budget. Understand that other people are going to see this schedule. So don't make it, we're going to spend $10 million a year on sidewalks if we can't spend $10 million a year on sidewalks. But also understand, if you say we're going to spend $10,000 a year on sidewalks, there's a good chance the public's going to come back and say, that's not enough. Like, that's not what we're looking for. So previously required by federal statute, the original timeline for completion was 1995. Robin mentioned this before. I'm going to mention it here again. The whole thought here is that everything was going to be done by 1995. It wasn't. So we're talking about how the transition plan isn't a requirement anymore. One of the reasons it's not a requirement is because everybody's expected to already have it done. So that's why I do think that the transition plan still has value, because the reason they wanted you to do it back in 1991 still applies to communities today. The only way it doesn't apply to you is if you don't have barriers. If you have barriers, you have to plan for how you're going to remove those barriers. Because ultimately the long-term goal is accessibility. The long-term goal is to have an accessible pedestrian network for everybody. And at the end of the day, this is a tool. It's a tool to be used for budgeting. It's a tool to be used for justification. It's a tool to be used for feedback. And if anybody ever comes and asks what you're doing, the power of being able to say, we're not accessible, but this is how we plan on becoming accessible, that's a far easier conversation than someone showing up and saying, what are you doing about accessibility? And you say, I don't know, I fix a sidewalk whenever someone calls and complains. To have that ability to say, we have a plan in place, it's going to take us a while to get there. Because that's the honest answer. This is not a quick process. But it's also a public document that's being approved by elected officials. So at the end of the day, set reachable goals, but I also encourage you to challenge the status quo. If you don't feel like the money you're spending on sidewalks today is not appropriate, it's probably not appropriate. So use this as an opportunity to say, if our goal is accessibility, this is what we have to do to get there. This is an opportunity for you to come in with hard numbers for your council and say, if you guys want an accessible community, this is what it's going to take. I am a big proponent of creating a separate budget line for barrier removal. Because if anybody ever asks how much money you're spending on sidewalks, it's a lot easier to say we've dedicated $200,000 to sidewalks than it is to say we have a $2 million street budget and we do sidewalks every once in a while out of that budget. Because if anybody ever asks the question, you're going to have a hard time figuring out exactly how much money you spent on sidewalks out of that street budget. It doesn't mean you don't include sidewalks in everything that you do, but it allows you to have that clear answer of, our baseline is this number, and then we incorporate sidewalks into everything else as we go along. Lastly, monitoring the progress of the plan. Coming up with this plan is a lot of effort. You can do it, but it's not a quick process. So if you're going to go through the process of doing it, who's responsible for the monitoring? You've established a schedule and budget. Who in your city is responsible for making sure that you're hitting that schedule and budget? I think this is a really important question to ask yourself. What is success for my community? Because we all say the answer is success is accessibility. But if accessibility is going to take us 50 years to get to, what's our 5-year success story? What's our 10-year success story? What are those metrics that we're looking to hit that ultimately says this was a good project and this was a good use of community funds? Monitor the priorities as the community evolves. Communities change. What was a young, kid-friendly community today, 20 years from now may be a primarily elderly community. They're going different places. So as your community evolves, have a plan that evolves with your community. And lastly, we talked about this yesterday with the self-evaluation, but think about how this is going to be updated. Because these assets are outside, on the ground. Sidewalk that's compliant today may not be compliant 10 years from now. And at the end of the day, the self-evaluation is a snapshot in time. That's all it is it tells you what your sidewalks were summer of 2023. So what's your plan moving forward to accurately reflect those sidewalks so that you can reflect what your actual condition is today? With that, open it up for any questions anybody might have on preparing a plan. Yes, sir. If you can hold on for a microphone.
This is just more of a comment, but I guess we've generally seen the IAC as being applicable to public rights of way. And I know in the presentation you've been referring more to PROAG, but I feel like the IAC is beneficial because it is something that is permanently in there to help you as a standard or guideline too.
Absolutely. And yeah, that's probably just something that we haven't hit on enough. The Illinois Accessibility Code is the umbrella code for everything in the state of Illinois. Whether that's interior, exterior, no matter what you do, the Illinois Accessibility Code applies to everything. And in a lot of cases for the public rights of way, they do sort of work together. So if you ever get in that argument with anybody of, well, PROAG isn't a guideline, Illinois Accessibility Code is most likely where you're going to be able to stand your ground and say, well, in the state of Illinois, we have to do this because the Illinois Accessibility Code says we have to do this. So I always find PROAG to be the first source that I go to, but the second source is always that Illinois Accessibility Code. On this, IDOT in the next year is also doing a bunch of ADA transition plan training that's going to be coming out. And one of the things that we're going to be working on, and it's going to be coming out shortly, is we're looking into doing a template for what this ADA transition plan document looks like. I will say that that is going to be tweaked over time as IDOT works through their process. But that is one thing that we're looking to do, is to come out with a template document that sort of lays out each of these goals and provides that guidance of what the plan is ultimately going to look like. I would say if you're in the planning process now, certainly don't stop. But that is one thing that is going to be rolled out in the near to intermediate future as IDOT really starts kicking off their project, is a statewide template of what an ADA transition plan looks like.
And in the training one, we gave some examples.
Yes. And then we have a bunch of examples of what local communities we consider to be good plans, as well as nationwide communities we consider to be good plans. But just to give everybody a heads up that IDOT, hopefully it's an IDOT CMAP joint template, but we'll see how IDOT responds to that, is coming down the pipeline in the future.
For you that weren't here yesterday, got brought up and mentioned, my name is Nicholas DeYoung. I am an ADA coordinator for the last 3 years or so. I've primarily been working out in the field with data collection. I've walked over 400, 500 miles of sidewalks, so I've seen every variety and condition of sidewalk, so I have a pretty good expertise on that. Along with that, I also am a walking grievance report for individuals that come up to tell me every problem in the world. So with that, I think we're going to get going and talk a little more about grievance reports. So to start off, the importance of grievance reports. Oh, it's not on. Perfect. So my one person can hear me.
It's on the bottom.
On the bottom?
It's the backside, it's really little.
There it is. Hello. So all grievance reports should be taken and handled in the same manner. That is an official document, that is meeting in person, that's a face-to-face connection that you come out in the field. Whether you have it in formal writing or not, a grievance report is to be taken seriously in all manners. With that, if someone has enough, someone coming to you and talking to you about a grievance report, it's obviously an important issue with them. It's impacting them on their day-to-day life. So this is to be written down. This is for us to take notice in the city, in our council meetings, or any other manner of that sort. Questions to consider when working with grievance reports. Is the ADA coordinator being directly notified of these reports, which is a very important matter. Whether it's a meeting in the council to be written down, to be passed on to an ADA coordinator, if this is being marked out by City Hall, is this being passed on to your ADA coordinator? How are they getting this? Is this a formal document? Is this something off their website? Is this a chat form that's just on your website in general? It's important that they are directly getting contacted to the ADA coordinator themselves. And then who has a final decision on the responses? Is this, again, your ADA coordinator? Is this someone that's going to go out and then go follow up these questions? Is this a council meeting that you have a discussion on how you report these things? It's important that you find out how each individual grievance report is reported back to you. And then who is overall the responsibility of handling these things. The city, the village, the council, the city hall, whoever, who is going to be in charge of responding and directly contacting these individuals, saying within, or like our example, I think we said 15 days, Travis, for our typicals, that you will have a response, whether that's, we'll get back to you on finding a better response, or we're to take this direct measure to answer your question. Whatever it is, it needs to be formally written down and given to your ADA coordinator on how we're responding and who's going to go out of their way to respond to that individual. And then on top of that is storing these responses. It's important that we write down and keep document of all of these responses that are coming into us. This is for legal allegations, is for any kind of just keeping record. It's also for a benefactor of us showing off that we responded and that we're taking action and taking steps forward and responding with these grievance reports as well. So we look at ways to address the complainant. The goal of a grievance report is not to send them down a rabbit hole of 5 different web pages and then basically making them get worn out and then not make the complaint, or give us awareness of a problem out in the community. We're not trying to make this like going to the DMV and they didn't check a box and now we're just going to throw this report out inside. That's not the goal of this. This is to get feedback from the community and know what we are needing to address, because those are the people that we are serving. This is a community engagement. We want to know what problems are out there. How else are we going to know what problems to solve if we don't have any examples or any understanding of what the people in our community want? And there's an openness to policies, procedures, schedules, and timeliness. You need to have a procedure in place that set what we're going to do, how we're going to respond, who is going to respond, and how we're going to address situations. And also, a lot of times we'll fall into this. You can't just use that we have a transition plan in place, so we're already set. That's not the answer. It's great that we have a transition plan. Hopefully that's for everyone's case. If not, this doesn't mean anything to the public. It's a written piece of form of paper for them. They don't see any response from this. They want to see actual action being placed. If there's a problem on their transition to getting from work, getting back from school, picking up their kids, going to the park, these are day-to-day problems that they face every day. And again, when they're writing down these procedures or grievance reports, this is something that impacts them every day. If not every day, it's an important thing to them, so they want to get this addressed. So with these reports, we want to find a way to catalog and address these. That's storing them for up to 3 years. That's the important part for our own sake. It's keeping them and the responses, that's important as well, together, and that we're addressing them in a, whether that's paper form, whether that's a database, whether that's we're keeping them in a council meeting and having them all written down. You need to keep track of every one of these. So that you store these and you assign a point person to each grievance report, whether that's one individual, that's your ADA coordinator, if it's a group of individuals that are all going to be addressing the situation, whether it's a project manager that's going to be developing a new sidewalk through this area, and you find out 50 feet down the road there's also an additional problem. Why not take care of it? For are we having a problem there that's been written out in a procedure? So if we store all these, keep them together, they will then be easy to fall back on, know that we've responded to that said situation, because the worst thing is to get a piece of paper falling onto your desk and then just get shuffled around and you never see the problem again. And then 2 years later, it's like, I wrote this in to you 2 years ago and it's still the same problem and it's only gotten worse. Nothing looks good in that situation for anyone involved. The person that got the response to begin with, the person that's writing it in has no faith in what we're doing. It's overall just important that we keep documentation, a formal response, and how we're responding to these individuals. And the problem is the answer is not always yes. We can't solve every single problem. Sometimes they aren't a ADA issue that we can just immediately change. Sometimes it's an individual that just says they want a new driveway because they can't get down it, and that's not something that we're going to be directly involved with. But it's important to still respond and know that we've come out of a way to respond to these individuals in your communities. And keeping everything in writing. Yes, it's important to document everything, but you need to keep all of your answers and your communication with them and how they've responded as well written down in a formal documentation. This is just a better way to keep track of how we're responding and finding out if we're even keeping track of these individuals, of these grievance reports, and of such. And you involve the city staff. So let's say that you're having a problem in the parking lot of that said park. Who's that going to be involved with? If there's going to be engineers that are involved, if your Parks and Rec are going to be involved, is this a city council meeting that you can't get into a room, so you need to bring in architects or engineers? This is going to be a whole city involvement. So not only the ADA coordinator is going to see through this, it's going to be a multitude of your city ordinances to come in and be working together. So involved another city staff are required. Reaching out to experts, whether that's reaching out to Robin with Great Lakes. Still from Missouri, from the Midwest. But reaching out to Robin or other expertise, other ADA coordinators, other individuals in different cities that are around you if they face these same problems or same grievance reports. It's better to find each other and have your expertise combined than to just blindly go in, like, I think this is the answer, I hope so, and then find out later we could have addressed this in a total better situation. So reaching out to individuals that you know have answers or ability to find answers for you to help these grievance reports get solved. And individuals to solve these. So with that, I'm going to pass this on to Travis, and we're going to go on to developing a transition plan.
I think what we see is communities are already doing all these steps. This is what you guys do whenever you take care of your population on a daily basis. All we're suggesting is documenting all that effort that you do and putting it in a file. We're not asking you to do anything new, do anything different. Just create that documentation, because what we find is that whenever someone leaves, the record of that happening leaves with that person. So if questions come up later, just document it, put it in the file, and then and really what it does is it documents all the great things that you guys do on a yearly basis. Next up on this is creating a schedule and a budget. So hit on this yesterday, go over this really quick for those of you who weren't here yesterday. It's really important, if you're going to come up with a plan to make your city accessible, the first question that you're going to get is how much money is it going to cost for us to make the city accessible? And I think if you can't answer that question, you're gonna have issues justifying getting the additional funding that you need for this to happen. So with that being said, establish standard construction cost. IDOT bid tabs are a great place to start. The challenge on those federally funded projects is that the scale might not match up with the scale of your sidewalk projects. Local bid tabs, do you have a feel in your community about how much you pay for this work? Also encourage you to build out your network of other municipalities and sort of start to get that feel for how much this work is costing. Include contingency for unforeseen cost. The example that I used yesterday is you have a sidewalk network that goes from street A to street B. You want to make that pedestrian network accessible, but there's a driveway in there that's at 8% grade going all the way back to the person's house. So it's not just the cost of replacing the sidewalk. You're going to have to replace that person's driveway to make your sidewalk accessible. So including those unforeseen conditions, because it's those unforeseen conditions that can really cause your cost estimates to be off. And then as you have to go back to the council and you can't show, if you said, I think I can do 3 miles of sidewalk this year for $1 million. But if at the end of the day you only did 1 mile in sidewalk, that makes the next money ask significantly more challenging. So include that contingency. Include those ancillary costs. Utilities, if you have drainage structures in the middle of your sidewalk, does that impact the cost of reconstructing the sidewalk? Mobilization and traffic control, especially if you're going to use bid tabs to come up with these cost estimates. Also take into account that you know, the bid tabs that you're using, the mobilization, traffic control, everything else may be accounted for somewhere else in that cost estimate. So you need to make sure that that's in your number. So most of the time what we suggest is just throwing a certain percentage on top of that sidewalk number to account for all those other costs that go into doing this work. Because really what this ultimately comes down to is what's the overall cost to bring your city into compliance? And once you have the answer to that question, now you can start planning for what is an allowable time frame. The appropriate time frame for every single municipality is different. If you're a newer municipality that feels, you know, does their self-evaluation and the sidewalks are generally in great shape, the answer might be 5 years. That might be a perfectly appropriate time frame for that community. If you're an older community who admittedly has not touched their sidewalks for the last 50 years, the time frame might be 50 years. It might take that long because you're reconstructing every single sidewalk in your community. So I can't give you a time frame that everybody needs to hit. What I encourage you to do is find the time frame that's appropriate for you and then consider, is this appropriate for my community? Does the community feel that this is an appropriate time frame? Are we pushing ourselves to make us accessible, or are we throwing 300 years on there and just saying, we'll figure it out as we go along? If the funding doesn't currently exist, what do you have to do to get funding to start improving your sidewalks? And this is the biggest thing that I'm a proponent for. Starting today is always better than starting tomorrow. At the end of the day, it's gonna take money to make your city accessible. So even if it's just a little start, that's better than no start, and then you can start building the momentum, start building the positive feelings about it, and then hopefully over time you can build a bigger program out of it. Everybody acknowledges that the schedule is going to take a while. This is not a quick process. It's also important to note that sidewalks that are compliant today may not be compliant in the future. This is why we advocate for having that plan to monitor your progress going forward. And lastly, unfortunately, there is no end to the obligation. In reality, for as long as you're a community, you're going to have ADA obligations as a community. And sidewalks always going to be falling out of compliance. So if the council says, well, if I just throw $5 million at this, am I good forever? The answer is no. You're going to be good for a certain amount of time, but at some point you're going to have to start maintaining those sidewalks again. Lastly, on executing the plan, just sort of general practices that we found works really well. Group together projects for efficiency. You're going to go through this entire prioritization process, But if your priorities are all around your community, you're going to get a higher construction cost to do that work. Can you group together those high priority projects and have that be a construction cost for 1 year? And then maybe the next year you go to the southwest side of town and hit all those priorities. The priorities are there to guide you. They're not there to hamstring you. So if you get a chance to get federal funds and reconstruct sidewalks as part of a federally funded project, but that sidewalk is a third tier priority, please reconstruct that sidewalk, because it's still not ADA compliant, and you can get funding assistance to make it ADA compliant. So while the prioritization is great, don't let it keep you from doing other improvements. Lastly, coordinate with pavement maintenance to minimize disruption. This is going on right now in my subdivision, and I'll tell you that it's driving me crazy. They went in last year, replaced all the slabs, shut down the roads, did all that. Now they're coming back this year and replacing all the curb ramps, and then they already told us that next year they're replacing our inlets. I'm sure they have a logical reason that they're doing it. I haven't been able to figure out what it is yet, and all it's leading to is ongoing road closures, and the residents are not thrilled about it. So as much as you possibly can, group these together, because not only is it residents' happiness, but you can also possibly get some cost efficiency going on with that as well. Lastly, and this is sort of your goals. Do you want your approach to this to be slab replacement? Is the goal to replace those single barriers that are the greatest barrier to access? Or is the goal, that you want to provide a pedestrian network that connects across the board? Slab replacement is great for fixing that challenge. But if you replace the slab and now someone in a wheelchair can go another house down before they hit their next obstruction, have you really changed their life? Or is it better to think about this as, we want to provide access routes from here to there? There's no right or wrong answer to that. It really just comes down to, what are your priorities as a city? That sort of wraps up our plan development section of the ADA transition plan. So before we move on, does anybody have any questions? Not seeing any. We wanted to go into a couple examples, local communities that we thought did a really good job. If this is one of your communities, congratulations, good work. Starting off, this is from the Cities of Des Plaines, and this is their statement on person of responsible charge. This is how they identified in their plan who their ADA coordinator is. You'll note on there that not only do they list a person, but that person has a title associated with them. So if that person ever leaves, which I believe John Light has left the City of Des Plaines, but it still ties back to the Director of Human Resources. So even as the person leaves, the title is still the ADA coordinator. Continuing on, it states who the ADA coordinator is. It establishes the process for filing a grievance internally and externally. Because that's part of this, is you have your public, but also if someone from city staff has an ADA issue, who do they go for that issue? And then lastly, and I didn't point this out before, I gotta read this tight. It also states that not only is there an ADA coordinator, but that last paragraph says, for issues within the public right-of-way, the Public Works and Engineering Department is the relevant department. So it's starting that process of creating those liaisons, in which the ADA coordinator is responsible for everything, but the plan clearly establishes who is responsible for the public right-of-way. The one issue I see on this, and it's a challenge that we see every day, is who is responsible for updating the website when the ADA coordinator leaves. I think it's an important question to ask. If you check most cities' websites, it's about 50-50 for whether the ADA coordinator is still there. I did a spot check of maybe 40 communities throughout Chicagoland, and it was about 20-20 as to whether they still worked for the city or not. So as that person leaves, update the website to make sure that that information is relevant. Village of Plainfield, this is their notice under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Robin talked about how we needed this. This is very clearly on their website. If you go to their website and search ADA, this pops up, and it's a very clear description of how Plainfield is going to handle ADA in their community. It's not hard to find. It's very easy. This is pretty much a template form that, they followed a template. They didn't need to do anything special. But the main thing that they did here is that they made it very easy for someone to find. Downers Grove, they chose to do things a little bit differently. They chose to use a responsibility matrix in which they broke up all their areas of responsibility throughout their community and assigned the department that was going to be responsible for that. The big advantage of this is if anybody has a complaint on an issue, they know who to go to. Because as Robin talked about, the ADA coordinator may not know anything about public works. So instead of having to call the ADA coordinator, they know that for intersections and pedestrian signals to call Will Lorton with Public Works. It makes that grievance procedure easier for the community member, which in terms just starts that relationship off on a good front. Because we talked a lot about this in the ADA coordinator presentation, but I'll mention it again here. This is someone who has a complaint. Odds are they're not going to be happy. There's something that they think that they are being aggrieved. I don't even know if that's the right word, but I'll say it. They think that something has happened to them. And the worst, and what we don't want to do is have them call someone in the city and the city goes, I don't know what to do about that. I don't even think that's my problem. Now all of a sudden, you've started that relationship off on the wrong foot. So if they clearly know who to reach out to, then they can get to the right person earlier, which just lets that communication happen better. Especially if the answer is no. A friendly no is a lot different than an unfriendly no. So if the answer is no, but you were receptive, you were helpful, they understand why the answer is no, that's a much better no than just not responding to them at all. Going back to Naperville. For the city of Naperville, they outlined their public involvement process. Their ADA transition plan clearly indicated what they did for the public. And it doesn't need to be, 20 pages long. It's just a very clear, this is how we reached out to the community. Because that way anybody who reads this and says, nobody told me you were doing an ADA transition plan, they're saying, we gave you a chance to know about this, you just didn't see it. The other good thing I like about this, and I think this is off the screen, is they say, if you want to comment on this today, reach out to us. I think it's important that for ADA transition plans, the public comment period never ends. If someone has a grievance, you want them coming to you. So what they did and what I encourage all you guys to do is to establish your goals of public involvement, document and publicize those goals, because really what this does is this creates accountability. It creates your stating what matters to you in community engagement, and what that leads to is following through on community engagement. Going back to Downers Grove, what they did is they clearly indicated where they're at today. It is available to the public that 26.4% of their curb ramps meet the current standard. 36.4% of them meet the previous standard. 33.6% of them needs a ramp update. They are defining what the challenge is. And what that allows you to do is it allows you to justify the timeline for fixing that. Because if you say we're going to need 50 years to fix our curb ramps, but you can't tell anybody why it's going to take that long to do it, that's a lot different than, look at this. We have to fix 1,200 curb ramps. That's going to take a while. This is how we're going to do it, but it allows you to show what work is going to need to be done. So it's the current compliance level of the asset, and it establishes the baseline condition. I also think the beauty of this is as you make those changes, you can document to people the good work that you've done. If anybody ever comes in and says, City of Aurora, what are you doing about ADA? We were at 33.6% with our ADA transition plan. That number is now down to 20%. That's clear progress. You're not there yet, but what it is that it's clear progress. Publicize and update the chart of improvements to occur to document that progress. Show off the work that you're doing. I think too many times we think that if we're not done yet, that we shouldn't publicize all the efforts that we're taking. I'd encourage you to celebrate your victories. That as you make the city more compliant, talk about how you're moving forward. Because if you wait till the very end of the process, nobody in your public knows that you're making these efforts. You're making the efforts, you're doing all the hard work, you're getting the funding, but you're not getting any of the credit for that work. Take the credit for the work that you guys are doing. Again, going back to Downers Grove, they clearly state what their available resources are. Fiscal year 16 budget includes $175,000 for the downtown business district crosswalk and accessibility improvements. They're saying what their budget is going to be. It establishes what the priority is. It identifies the funding source, which we already talked about the importance of that. It identifies the funds that are available and in which fiscal year they are available. So, again, that number is going to be different for everybody. There's no perfect answer to what that number is, but it's that transparency of this is how we're going to go about doing it. For Naperville, they list what their goals are. They clearly state, these are the ongoing things that we can do. These things are going to take us 5 years to get done. You know, what's our short-term goal? You know, one of their short-term goals is seek to incorporate ADA work into all construction progress as applicable. That's the short-term goal. They could easily do that. Seek to improve access to ADA training resources. That's something they could do tomorrow, and there's no cost associated with that. However, in the next 5 years, they want to inventory and prioritize always stop intersections. They're not even done with their self-evaluation yet, and they're stating what their goals are. So they're acknowledging that they haven't finished the self-evaluation, but they have a plan to finish it. So what you can do is you can establish short, near, and long-term goals. And really what you're doing at the end of the day is you're acknowledging that completing this process takes time. So the big question becomes, who is responsible for the follow-through? All this is great. This is a fantastic document. But if you don't follow through on that document, you haven't done the last step. The last step of this is always follow through. Whether it's construction, whether it's modifying your programs, whatever it might be, the last step of this is following through on that process. If anybody's interested, we have links on here to all 4 of those ADA transition plans. Whenever the final PowerPoint will be posted on CMAP's website, if you pull up this spreadsheet, it's just a hyperlink. You can click on them and go to their ADA transition plans. I think they're all great examples. Sort of outside the area, some other ADA transition plans that we think are good. Tacoma, Washington did a very good one that was done in-house. Because an in-house ADA transition plan is always going to look a little different than a consultant ADA transition plan. So if you're looking to do it sort of in-house, I think Tacoma, Washington has a great example of that. Evanston as well did theirs in-house. And Bloomington did theirs with a consultant, but that is a 2022. They approved theirs last year. So if you're looking for a very recent example, Bloomington provides a good example. Minneapolis, Minnesota, if you're someone who has previously prepared an ADA transition plan and are wondering what it looks like to update that plan, strongly encourage you to look at Minneapolis. They recently updated their plan, and I think that's a very good example. Lastly, Brooklyn Park, Minnesota, Highlands Ranch, Colorado, also 2 very strong ADA transition plans. As I mentioned, there is going to be that template document that's going to be coming out in the near future, but I think it's really helpful, and honestly, as a consultant, I look at these examples as well, of what are other cities doing, and what do I like about them, and what do I not like about them. Because as I think we've already hit on a couple times, this is an isolating job. ADA coordinator is an isolating job, but it's important to know that other communities have done this and lean on what they learned to go through this process. Resources, a lot of these are the same resources as yesterday, but everything that we talked about today as far as a resource is available in this PowerPoint. The federal standards, the Illinois Accessibility Code, the state standards, IDOT standards, access to the Great Lakes ADA Center. Really what our goal long-term is that if you have a question about ADA, you can click on that link to CMAP's website, and somewhere in there is going to at least be a start to the answer to your question. With that being said, just a quick review. Hopefully, a better understanding of the value of community engagement and the variety of community engagement that is available, the value of prioritization, the steps of an ADA plan, how the grievance procedure process can work outside the overall ADA plan, creating a schedule and budget, and lastly, executing the plan itself. So that's kind of the end of our talk today. So I'll take a second if anybody has any questions about anything related to ADA. Love to take those at this point. If it is a question that is very specific to you, I might just suggest that we talk afterwards, but any and all questions that anybody might have. Okay, not seeing anything. Sort of what this looks like is we are going to do this again in the fall of 2023. Our goals are we're going to send out surveys after this. If you didn't hear about something you wanted to hear about, please tell us. This is intended, we don't just want to give the exact same presentations again. We want to give the presentations that work and meet the needs that you guys are looking for them to meet. So whether it's tomorrow or whether it's a month from now, if there's something that you want to hear, please tell us about it. One of the things we got out of yesterday is reaching out to the city managers, the mayors, sort of those groups of people in that education. So what we're going to look to do in the fall is how we increase their participation in this. So really this is the start of a long-term commitment from CMAP for ADA accessibility. So if there's anything that you wanted to hear about and you don't think you heard about it, please tell us. We'll adjust this. We'll come back in the fall and we'll be ready to sort of modify this and meet your guys' needs. Jamie, anything to add?
Yeah, a few things.
Thank you again, Travis. So just kind of reiterating, we are going to be reassessing over the summer, coming back in the fall. We're going to repeat modules 1 through 4, but with additional information that we hear from you all. Another thing that I do want to highlight, we're looking to partner with Felicia Burton at the Capital Development Board. And so we're hoping to have kind of a two-part, because I know a lot of the questions deal with facilities. And sadly, our funding does not cover anything really outside of the right-of-way. So we're hoping that we can partner with Felicia and then provide additional resources, because as we know, transition plans aren't just limited to the right-of-way, they include all facilities in your communities as well. So be on the lookout for that. And just an update for what CMAP is doing overall. Like Travis said, this is part of a larger program that we are doing. Hopefully in a few months we'll be kicking off some technical assistance programs, and we will be providing transition plans to 5 communities throughout the region. That was through our LTA program, Call for Projects. So we will plan to continue to provide transition plans through a consultant for communities throughout the region. So please be on the lookout for the Call for Projects. We usually do it once or twice a year. So we had this first round, but we do have funding for additional rounds for technical assistance. But I will say, don't wait for that. You know, if you can start with your self-evaluations and transition plans now, please do so. It is a very highly competitive process. We're also going to be doing a lot of research because CMAP really wants to be that data and resource hub. So if you have questions with regard to transition plans and self-evaluations, particularly to the right-of-way. I see no lights. There. Did it die? Oh, technical. Okay. So yeah, so we're going to be a data source template. We have a partner at UIC who works with Robin Yochai Eisenberg. He's fantastic. He's actually developed a transition plan checklist. So as you develop your transition plan, you can just make sure that you're checking all these boxes. I know we want to get a lot of our decision makers on board. So I didn't mention yesterday, but CMAP, we kind of have a presentation that we've been providing to all of our Council of Governments and Council of the Mayors. So if you do want us to speak to your village board, let us know. Get us on an agenda. We'd be happy to come out and present this information and discuss the importance of accessibility in your communities. Again, want to lean on Robin and the ADA Great Lakes Center as a fantastic resource. If you haven't noticed already, she pretty much knows everything, and she's like an insane encyclopedia of knowledge. So please tap into that resource. And with that, again, I want to thank you all so much for your commitment to increasing accessibility in your communities and thus the CMAP region. And hope to see you all again. And please fill out your surveys when you get them. So thank you so much.